Abigail Whitmore stood in the middle of Main Street, her hands shaking, her chin lifted high, staring down three ranch hands who had just laughed about her future like she wasn't standing close enough to hear every word. Cedar Hollow had already decided who she was. Too proud, too strong, too much for any man to want. She had swallowed that verdict for 6 long years. But today something inside her finally broke open. Before you hear what she said next, and who stepped out of the crowd to answer her, hit subscribe and drop the name of the city you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1882 sat heavy over Cedar Hollow, Montana, the kind of heat that made men short-tempered and women tired of being looked at. Abigail Whitmore had learned to walk through that heat the same way she walked through everything else in this town, with her spine straight and her eyes forward, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She heard them before she saw them. 3 ranch hands from the Graysons spread leaning against the hitching post outside the Mercantile, voices pitched just loud enough to carry. "I'll wager $2 she dies an old maid in that store." One of them said, a lanky boy named Curtis with a gap in his teeth. "Ain't a man in this territory fool enough to take her on." $3 says no man even tries, said the second older, heavier a man called Boyd. "Woman like that don't want a husband, she wants to be one." The third laughed so hard he had to lean on the post. Abigail's feet stopped moving before her mind gave the order. She stood there in the street, a crate of nails balanced against her hip, and felt something crack loose in her chest that she had been holding shut for years. She thought of every Sunday she'd sat alone in the second-to-last pew, while whispers moved behind gloved hands. She thought of every mother who'd steered her daughter to the other side of the street. She thought of the letter she'd burned 3 winters back, the one from a man in Bozeman who'd asked her to marry him, and then withdrawn the offer 2 weeks later because his own mother said a woman who ran a business alone would never make a proper wife. She set the crate down on the boardwalk, slow and deliberate, and walked toward the 3 men. "Say it to my face," she said. Curtis straightened up fast, the color draining out of his cheeks. "Ma'am, we didn't mean nothing by it." "You meant every word of it," Abigail said. "You've been saying it for years. All of you have. You just usually wait until you think I've walked far enough not to hear." Boyd found his nerve first crossing his arms over his chest, like the words gave him some kind of armor. "Ain't no crime in speaking truth, Miss Whitmore. Man wants a wife who needs him. You don't need nobody. Everybody in this town knows it." "I don't need a man to survive," Abigail said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands wanted to. "That is not the same as not wanting one. But I would rather be alone until I am buried than spend one single day married to a man who thinks my strength is something to be fixed." A woman across the street had stopped to watch. Then another. A shopkeeper stood in his doorway with a broom forgotten in his hand. Cedar Hollow loved a spectacle, and it seemed the whole town had decided this one was worth stepping outside for. "You want to know why no man's come courting?" Boyd said, his voice rising now, playing to the gathering crowd. "It ain't because you're too strong, Miss Whitmore. It's because you're too hard. There's a difference. A man wants a woman he can come home to, not one who makes him feel like he's walked into a business negotiation." Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Not everyone, but enough. Abigail felt the heat climb up her throat. She had rehearsed dignity for 6 years. She had rehearsed silence. She had told herself that a woman who answered cruelty only proved the cruel men right, that dignity meant walking past it with her head high and her mouth shut. She was tired of being dignified. "You want to talk about hard," she said, and something dangerous had crept into her voice now. "I buried my father alone. I dug the post holes on this store's foundation with my own 2 hands, because no man in this town would extend credit to a woman running a business without a husband's name on the paper. I have carried every crate mended, every wagon wheel, and kept half the ranching families in this valley fed through 2 bad winters, when your own boss was too busy foreclosing on widows to notice they were starving. So don't you dare stand there and tell me what makes a woman hard, when none of you have ever once had to survive without somebody else's name to hide behind." The street had gone silent enough to hear a dog barking 3 blocks over. Curtis wouldn't meet her eyes anymore. Boyd's jaw worked like he wanted to answer and couldn't find the words. The third man had stopped laughing entirely. It was in that silence that Abigail noticed him, a stranger standing near the old fence rail at the edge of the crowd, one boot propped on the bottom rail, a battered gray hat pulled low against the sun. He hadn't laughed. Not once, not even at the start, when half the street had been grinning along with Boyd's cruelty, like it was the finest entertainment Cedar Hollow had seen all season. He was watching her the way a man watches something he's trying to understand, rather than something he's already decided about. "Something funny to you two, stranger," Abigail said, because 6 years of being watched and judged had taught her to strike first. The man straightened off the fence, unhurried, and touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "No, ma'am. Nothing funny about it at all." His voice was low, rough at the edges, like a man who didn't use it often. He looked to be somewhere past 30, built like the mountains he'd likely come down from, shoulders wide enough to fill out a doorway, a few days of beard shadowing a jaw that looked like it had been set once and never softened since. His eyes were the kind of pale gray-green you saw in creek water in early spring, and they were fixed on her without a trace of pity, which was somehow more unsettling than sympathy would have been. "Then what are you looking at?" she said. "A woman who just told the truth in a street full of people who'd rather she'd kept quiet," he said. "Don't see that every day." Boyd rounded on him, glad for a new target. "This ain't your business, mister. You ain't even from around here." "No," the stranger agreed easily. "I ain't." "Then you might want to mind your own affairs and let a man handle his." The stranger's eyes moved from Boyd to Abigail and back again, slow, unbothered, the way a man might look over a fence line to judge how much work it would take to mend it. "Way I see it," he said, "there's 3 of you and 1 of her, and you were 3 grown men laughing at a woman's expense in the middle of a public street. Don't seem like there's much handling left to do. Seems like she already handled it." A few onlookers laughed at that real laughter this time, not the ugly kind, and Boyd's ears went red. "You don't know her," Boyd said. "You don't know the first thing about her." "Reckon that's true," the stranger said. "But I know what I just watched, and I know a coward when 3 of him are standing in front of me picking on somebody who spent her whole life proving she don't need saving." Boyd took a step forward, chest puffed, and for one taut second, Abigail thought there might be real trouble in the street. Then the stranger simply shifted his weight, unhurried, planting himself an inch closer, and something in the stillness of him made Boyd think better of it. "Come on," Boyd muttered to the other 2. "Ain't worth the trouble." They slunk off toward the saloon, Curtis glancing back once with something that might have been shame on his young face. The crowd began to disperse the way crowds do when the show is over, murmuring behind their hands, already reshaping the story into whatever version would travel fastest through Cedar Hollow by supper. Abigail was left standing in the street with a stranger she had never seen before in her life. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "Didn't do it for you," he said. "Did it because I don't much care for men who need 3 against 1 to feel brave." That more than anything was what made her look at him properly for the first time. Not as a rescuer, not as a threat, but as a man who seemed entirely unconcerned with whether she thanked him or not. "Abigail Whitmore," she said finally, because it seemed foolish to keep standing there without names between them. "Caleb Stone." He touched his hat again, briefer this time, like the gesture embarrassed him. "I run cattle up in the high country about 2 days' ride from here. Came down for supplies." "Then you'll want the mercantile," she said, nodding toward the crate she'd abandoned on the boardwalk. "That's mine." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly, more like a man recalculating a sum he'd already worked out wrong. "You run it yourself?" "I do." "Alone?" "That surprise you?" "No, ma'am," he said, and there was something almost like respect in it. "Just didn't expect the woman they were all talking about to be the same one keeping half the valley fed through hard winters. Word travels different than truth, I suppose." "It usually does," Abigail said. "You'll find that out quick enough if you stay in Cedar Hollow long." "Don't plan to stay," he said. "Few days, maybe. Enough to load supplies and get back before the weather turns. Then I suppose I'll see you at the counter, she said, and picked her crate back up before he could offer to carry it because she had learned a long time ago that letting a man carry things for her only fed the story that she couldn't. If Caleb noticed the deliberate refusal, he didn't comment on it. He only nodded once, like a man filing something away for later consideration, and let her walk on ahead of him toward the store. The mercantile smelled like cedar shavings and coffee beans. The two smells Abigail had never managed to separate in 6 years of running the place, no matter how she arranged the stock. She set the crate of nails behind the counter and turned to find Caleb Stone already standing in the doorway, hat in hand, now looking around the shelves with the careful attention of a man used to counting every dollar before he spent it. "You'll want flour salt coffee if you're heading back up the mountain," she said, moving behind the counter like she hadn't just spent the last hour being humiliated in the street in front of half the town. "Ammunition if you're planning on hunting through fall. Anything else depends on how long you mean to be gone." "You always run inventory in your head that fast." "I run a business," she said. "It's my job to know what a man needs before he says it out loud. Most men'd be insulted by that." "Most men aren't standing in my store," she said, and something in his mouth almost curved into a smile before he caught it. He moved along the shelves while she worked picking items with the economy of a man who'd spent a long time provisioning for himself and nobody else. Flour, salt pork, a length of new rope. He set each item on the counter without asking the price the way a man does when he's already decided he can afford whatever it costs and doesn't need reassurance. "You said you run cattle alone," Abigail said, tallying the total in the store ledger. "No hands, no family up there with you." The question landed somewhere it wasn't meant to. She saw it in the brief stillness that passed over his face, quick as a cloud crossing the sun, gone almost before she could name it. "Just me," he said. "That's a hard way to live. 2 days from the nearest town." "Suits me fine. Doesn't sound like it suits you," she said, because 6 years of being told what her own life should look like had made her sharp enough to hear the same false note in someone else's voice. "Sounds like something you settled for." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought he might tell her to mind her own business the way Boyd had tried to, earlier the way most men did when a woman asked them a question they weren't prepared to answer honestly. Instead, he said, "Had a wife once, and a boy." Abigail's hands went still over the ledger. "Diphtheria took them both inside of a week," Caleb said, and his voice didn't break, didn't even shift much, like the words had been worn so smooth by repetition in his own head that saying them out loud cost less than she'd have expected. 6 years back now. I sold the ranch we had down in the valley. Couldn't stand looking at the rooms. Bought high land instead where a man don't need to talk to nobody if he don't want to." "I'm sorry," Abigail said, and meant it plainly without the performance of sympathy she'd learned to distrust in other people's mouths. "Ain't your doing," he said. "Just explaining why a man might choose to live alone on a mountain instead of a valley full of neighbors. Some folks think it's queer. Figured you might understand it better than most, because I chose something similar." "Didn't say chose," Caleb said. "Man in the street said you needed a husband's name to get credit for this place. Didn't sound like you had much choice in the matter running it alone." "I had a choice," Abigail said. "I chose to keep the store instead of marrying a man who only wanted it for the deed. Chose to dig post holes myself instead of begging the bank for patience they weren't inclined to give a woman. Every year since I've chosen it again. Might not have started as a choice, Mr. Stone, but it's mine now." Something in his face changed, then not softened exactly. Caleb Stone didn't strike her as a man given to softening, but settled like a scale finding its balance. "Caleb," he said, "Mr. Stone was my father, and he wasn't much worth the name." "Then I suppose you can call me Abigail," she said, "provided you don't say it the way the rest of this town says my name, like it's something to apologize for." "Don't reckon I've ever apologized for a woman doing her job well," he said. "Seems a foolish thing to apologize for." They finished the tally in something close to comfortable quiet. After that, Abigail adding the last of his order while Caleb counted coin from a worn leather pouch, and it was the first time in longer than she could remember that a man had stood across her counter without either pitying her or trying to correct her. She didn't examine too closely why that mattered as much as it did. The bell over the door rang twice more before closing, and both times it was gossip walking in on two legs before it was customers. Norma Wells arrived first. A stout woman with sharp eyes and a mouth that had never once in Abigail's memory kept a secret past sundown, ostensibly shopping for thread, but clearly there to inspect the stranger who'd made a spectacle of Boyd Caro in the street. "I heard you had quite the morning," Norma said, not bothering to lower her voice, though Caleb was still at the far shelf examining a coil of rope. "I had an ordinary morning that other people decided to make into a spectacle," Abigail said. "They're saying that man defended your honor. He defended nothing. He pointed out that 3 grown men picking on one woman in a public street wasn't much of an accomplishment. That's not the same as defending my honor, Norma. My honor doesn't need defending. It was never in question." Norma's eyes flicked toward Caleb, assessing the same way she assessed every piece of gossip that walked through Cedar Hollow, sorting it for value, before deciding how far to spread it. "Handsome, though. Where'd he come from?" "Up the mountain," Abigail said. "He's here for supplies. He'll be gone in a few days." "Pity," Norma said in the tone of a woman already composing the story she'd tell at church on Sunday. "Man like that could do a woman some good." "I don't need a man to do me any good, Norma. I've managed the last 6 years without one." "Managing isn't the same as living, dear," Norma said. And there it was again, the same old verdict dressed up in a softer voice, but no less final. "You've built yourself a fine little fortress here, but a fortress is a lonely place to grow old in." Abigail wrapped Norma's thread without answering, because there was no answer that would satisfy a woman who had already decided the shape of Abigail's whole life, before Abigail had finished living any of it. Norma left with her thread and her opinions intact, and it was only after the bell had stopped ringing that Abigail realized Caleb had heard every word of it. "She's not wrong that this town's decided who I am," Abigail said before he could say anything, because she'd rather address it herself than have it hang unspoken between them. "They decided it years ago. Too proud, too hard, too much. I stopped trying to argue with it a long time back." "Seems to me," Caleb said, setting the rope on the counter, "a town that spends this much energy deciding who a woman is probably never once bothered asking her." "They asked once," Abigail said. "I told them the truth. They didn't care for the answer, so they stopped asking and started deciding instead. Easier that way. Doesn't require them to actually look at anybody." "I looked," Caleb said, and it wasn't flirtation in his voice. Nothing practiced or smooth about it. Just plain fact, stated the way a man states the weather. "Saw a woman who built something out of nothing and never once asked anybody's permission to do it. Don't know what else there is to see, but that seemed like plenty." Abigail didn't have a ready answer for that. 6 years of sharpened replies, and this stranger from the mountains had found the one sentence that left her without one. "You should finish your supplies before the light goes," she said instead, because it was easier than sitting with whatever had just moved through her chest. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, and there was something almost like amusement in it, gentle, not mocking, and he went back to gathering what he needed, while Abigail busied herself with the ledger and told herself very firmly that this was nothing more than a stranger passing through, gone by week's end, and none of it worth the unsteady feeling still sitting behind her ribs. The trouble that would come to define that summer didn't announce itself the way trouble often does with thunder or gunfire or a rider coming in hard on a lathered horse. It came instead in the shape of a well-dressed man stepping through Abigail's door 2 days later, smelling of pomade and money, with a smile that had been practiced in front of enough mirrors to look almost sincere. Silas Grayson owned more land in the valley than any 3 other ranchers combined, and everybody in Cedar Hollow understood without ever saying it plainly that Silas Grayson had not acquired most of it honestly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat with a flourish that felt like mockery dressed as manners. "I trust business is good." "Business is fine, Mr. Grayson. What can I get for you?" "Nothing today," he said, wandering the aisle with the unhurried air of a man who owned the ground beneath his boots even when he didn't. "I've come about a different matter entirely." This store of yours sits on a fine piece of land. Corner lot, good water access, right at the crossing where every rancher in the valley passes twice a season. I'd like to buy it. It's not for sale. It's not. Everything's for sale. Miss Whitmore provided the numbers right. He named a figure then, and it was generous. Generous enough that a lesser woman might have wavered simply from the shock of it. I'd let you keep running it another year if you liked under my ownership, just to ease the transition. No need for anything to change, but the name on the deed. The name on the deed is the only thing that matters to you, Abigail said. Everything else stays the same except I'd be working for you instead of for myself. No, Mr. Grayson, this store isn't for sale. Not for that number, and not for any number. Something flickered behind his practiced smile, brief and cold. A woman running a business alone is a fragile arrangement, Miss Whitmore. Fragile arrangements have a way of failing, especially when circumstances shift. Is that a threat? It's an observation, Grayson said. Banks call in notes. Suppliers change terms. Weather ruins shipments. All manner of things can happen to a business that has no husband, no partner, nothing but one woman's stubbornness holding it together. I'd hate to see something happen to a place I admire so much. You'll have to try harder than veiled threats over a counter, Mr. Grayson. I've survived worse than you. He set his hat back on with the same practiced flourish. We'll speak again, Miss Whitmore. I find that circumstances have a way of changing people's minds. The bell rang behind him, and Abigail stood alone in the store with her heart hammering harder than she'd let herself show because she recognized the particular flavor of that threat. She had watched Silas Grayson buy out 3 other small operations in the valley over the past 2 years, each one through some combination of forged debt, manufactured scandal, or land claims that materialized out of nowhere with signatures nobody could quite verify. She had watched good families lose everything to paperwork that appeared just official enough to hold up in a territory with one overworked judge and no real means of contesting it. She had always assumed she was too small, too insignificant for Grayson to bother with. She understood now that she had been wrong. Caleb returned to the store the next morning, ostensibly for a length of chain he claimed to have forgotten, though Abigail suspected the chain was an excuse built after the fact, rather than a genuine oversight, given that he'd inventoried his needs with such precision 2 days before. She told him about Grayson anyway. She hadn't planned to. It simply came out of her while she wrapped his purchase low and fast, the words arriving before she'd decided whether she trusted him enough to say them. Caleb's face went very still while she spoke, the particular stillness of a man deciding how much anger to let show. He threatened you outright. Not outright. Grayson's smarter than that. He talks about fragile arrangements and things that happen to businesses without husbands. Never says the word threat. Never has to. I've heard his name before, Caleb said. Even up in the high country, word travels about a man who buys land the way he does. Forged deeds. Debts that appear overnight on operations that were solvent a season before. Man like that doesn't stop because a woman tells him no. I know that, Abigail said. I've watched him do it to 3 other families already. I always thought I was too small for him to bother with. You're not small, Caleb said. You're sitting on the best corner lot in the valley, and you just told him no to his face in front of God and everybody. Man like Grayson doesn't forgive a no. He collects it and waits for a way to make you regret it. You sound like you know him. I know men like him, Caleb said. Mountains full of ranchers who got run off by exactly his kind further west before I ever came to this territory. Different names, same appetite. Man who takes what he wants and dresses it up as business. Then what do I do? It was the first time in 6 years Abigail had asked another person that question, and meant it. And she felt the shape of it, sitting strange in her mouth, unfamiliar, the way asking for help always felt to a woman who had built her whole life on the principle of never needing to. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, the same careful, unhurried attention he'd given her in the street 2 days before, like he was weighing something and wanted to be certain before he set it down. You do what you've been doing, he said finally. You hold the ground. But you don't hold it alone this time. Not if you don't want to. I know you don't need, Caleb said, and there was no impatience in it, only a kind of quiet certainty that stopped her cold. Nobody said a word about need. I'm saying you shouldn't have to hold a man like Grayson off by yourself, just because you've spent 6 years proving you could hold everything else off by yourself. There's a difference between not needing help and not deserving it. Abigail felt something crack open in her chest for the second time in 3 days, though this crack didn't hurt the way the first one had out there in the street with Boyd Caro's laughter ringing in her ears. This one felt more like a window opening in a room she hadn't realized had gone stale with shut air. "You said you weren't staying," she said, because it was easier to point at the practical problem than to sit with the feeling underneath it. "Few days, you said. Back to the mountain before the weather turns." "Said that before I knew Grayson had his eye on this place," Caleb said. "Man's got a right to change his plans." "I won't ask you to stay because of me." "You didn't ask," Caleb said. "I'm telling you, I'm choosing to. There's a difference in that, too." Outside, the street had gone about its ordinary business wagons and voices, and the particular hum of a town that had no idea it was about to be tested. Inside the store, Abigail Whitmore stood across the counter from a mountain cowboy who had buried a wife and a son and built a wall of solitude around himself, 2 days' ride from anyone who might ask anything of him, and felt for the first time in longer than she could name something that was not quite hope but stood close enough to its shadow to frighten her. "Grayson won't stop with words," she said. "You should know that before you decide anything." "Didn't figure he would," Caleb said. "Men like him rarely do." He left with his chain and his supplies, and Abigail stood behind her counter long after the bell had gone quiet, turning over the strange new fact that somewhere between a public humiliation and a threat over her own counter, she had stopped being entirely alone in Cedar Hollow, and she did not yet know whether that terrified her more than Silas Grayson did. Caleb Stone did not leave Cedar Hollow that week. He told himself it was the supplies that a man needed. More rope, more nails, another sack of flour before winter crept down off the peaks. He told himself it was practical business, nothing more. But every excuse he invented led him back through the same door, past the same bell, to the same woman standing behind the same counter, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her ledger open in front of her, like a shield she'd built out of numbers. "You're back again," Abigail said, not looking up from the column she was totaling. "Ran short on chain." "You bought chain 2 days ago." "Wasn't enough of it." She looked up, then one eyebrow lifted, and there was something almost like amusement fighting its way through the exhaustion on her face. "Mr. Stone, you are the worst liar I have ever done business with, and I have done business with Silas Grayson." "Didn't say I was lying," Caleb said. "Said I ran short." "You ran short on excuses to be standing in my store," Abigail said, "which is a different kind of short entirely." He didn't deny it. That surprised her more than anything else he might have said. Most men caught out reached for some clumsy defense. Caleb only stood there, hat in his hands, and let the truth sit plain between them, without dressing it up. "Grayson's not the kind of man who threatens once and walks away," he said instead. "Figured you'd want somebody in town who wasn't afraid of him while you sorted out what he means to do next. And that somebody has to be you. Didn't see anybody else volunteering?" Abigail set down her pen. "The whole town watched you stand up for me in the street 3 days ago. If you stay through the week, they'll have us married by Sunday sermon, whether either of us says a word about it." "Let them talk," Caleb said. "Talking's free. Doesn't cost either one of us anything unless we let it." "Easy for you to say. You'll be back up your mountain by first snow. I'll still be standing behind this counter listening to Norma Wells speculate about my virtue for the next 20 years. Something flickered across his face at that quick and unreadable gone before she could name it. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe a man decides some things are worth the talk." Abigail didn't have an answer ready for that, and the silence that followed felt too large for the small room, so she busied her hands with the ledger again, and Caleb let her, and neither one of them said what was sitting plain and unspoken between them. The bell rang hard enough to rattle the glass that afternoon, and a woman Abigail recognized as Sarah Miller came stumbling through the door with her youngest boy on her hip, and panic written so clear across her face that Abigail came around the counter, before Sarah had even managed a full sentence. "They're saying we owe $800, Sarah said, breathless, the words tumbling out too fast. $800, Abigail. My Thomas never signed a note for that kind of money in his life. We don't have $200 to our name, let alone 8. "Slow down," Abigail said, guiding her to the chair behind the counter. "Who's saying this?" "Grayson's man. Come out to the ranch this morning with papers. Said Thomas's father took out a loan against the land 11 years back before he passed, and the note's coming due with interest, and if we can't pay it by month's end, the bank takes the ranch, and Grayson's offered to buy the note outright, so it doesn't even go through the courts proper." Caleb, who had been examining a coil of wire near the back shelf, with the studied patience of a man pretending not to listen, was suddenly very much listening. 11 years is a long time for a note to sit quiet and then suddenly come due, he said. Sarah looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "That's what Thomas said. Said his father never mentioned any loan. Said the signature on the paper doesn't even look right the way his father crossed his T's. But what's a signature worth against a man with Grayson's money and Grayson's judge? Judge Pruitt's not for sale," Abigail said, though even as she said it, doubt crept into her own voice. "Judge Pruitt owes half his cattle herd to grazing rights on Grayson land," Caleb said quietly. "Man doesn't have to be dishonest to be beholden. Sometimes beholden does the same work as bought, just slower, and with better manners." Sarah's boy started crying, the thin, exhausted wail of a child who understood something was wrong even without the words for it, and Sarah pulled him closer, her own composure cracking at the edges. "I don't know what to do," she said. "Thomas is out trying to find someone who'll vouch the signature's forged, but who's going to stand up against Grayson in this valley. Everybody's scared of ending up like the Coopers, or the Delaney's, or me," Abigail finished quietly. Sarah's eyes flicked up guilty, like she hadn't meant to say it but couldn't take it back now that it hung in the air. "It's all right," Abigail said. "I know what this town says. Doesn't mean it isn't true. Grayson's been picking off small operations for 2 years, and everyone's watched him do it, and nobody's stopped him yet, because everyone's too afraid they're next." "You extend credit to half the ranchers in this valley," Sarah said. "You're the only reason some of us made it through last winter. If Grayson takes your store next, there won't be anybody left willing to stand up to him." Abigail felt the weight of that settle onto her shoulders, heavier than anything Boyd Caro had said to her in the street 3 days ago, because this wasn't about her pride anymore. This was about whether an entire valley of families would survive a man's greed. "Bring me whatever papers Thomas has," she said. "The forged note if you can get a copy. I want to see the signature myself." "What good will that do?" "Because I've handled enough contracts and bills of sale in this store to know a genuine signature from a copied one," Abigail said. "And because somebody in this town needs to start keeping a record of every single thing Grayson's done, so that when enough of it piles up there's proof instead of just whispers." Sarah's face shifted something like hope, breaking through the fear. "You do that even with your own trouble, especially because of my own trouble," Abigail said. "Man's got a pattern. Patterns can be proven. Threats can't." Grayson came to the store himself 2 mornings later, no pretense of shopping this time, his boots loud and deliberate on the boardwalk outside, before the bell announced him. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his smile had lost some of its earlier polish, sharpened now into something closer to a warning. "I hear you've taken an interest in the Miller family's private business. Their business became public the moment you sent a man out with a forged note," Abigail said. "Forged is a strong word." "It's the correct word," Abigail said. "Thomas Miller's father never signed that note, and you know it because there's no bank record of any loan issued to the Miller Ranch 11 years back. Not in this territory, not in the neighboring one either. I checked." Grayson's jaw tightened just barely, the first genuine crack Abigail had seen in his composure since he'd first walked through her door offering to buy her out. "You checked?" "I checked," Abigail said. "It's a small thing to do writing letters to a few banks in neighboring counties. Takes a stamp and a little patience. Turns out patience is something I have plenty of." "That's a dangerous hobby for a woman running a business alone," Grayson said, "investigating men with more resources than she has." Is that a threat too, Mr. Grayson? You seem to specialize in those lately. I don't make threats, Miss Whitmore. I make observations about consequences. He glanced toward the back of the store where Caleb had gone still and silent among the shelves watching. I understand you've acquired yourself a protector. Mountain man, I hear. Widower. Sad story, that. Lost a wife and a boy to fever, didn't he? Man like that, all that grief sitting in him. Dangerous thing, grief. Makes a man reckless. Makes him do things he might regret. Defending a woman who isn't even his to defend. Caleb crossed the store, slow, unhurried, the same deliberate calm Abigail had watched him carry in the street days before, and stopped close enough that Grayson had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. You've got something to say to me directly, Grayson. You can say it without hiding behind a counter and a woman's business. I was simply expressing concern for your welfare, Mr. Stone. No, you weren't, Caleb said. You were trying to see if grief makes a man easy to scare. It doesn't. Grief already took everything I was afraid to lose. Man's got nothing left to threaten him with. He's about the most dangerous kind of man you'll ever meet because you can't hold anything over him he isn't already prepared to lose. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Grayson recovered his smile, though it cost him visibly this time. Well, I do hope that isn't a threat, Mr. Stone. I'd hate to have to involve the sheriff. Sheriff Daniels is a fair man, Abigail said. I imagine he'd be very interested in a forged note with a signature that doesn't match bank records in 2 counties. Sheriff Daniels, Grayson said, straightening his coat with exaggerated care, answers to a county that funds half its budget through taxes on my land holdings. But you go right ahead and take your complaint to him, Miss Whitmore. See how far it gets you. He left with the bell ringing hollow behind him, and Abigail stood there with her hands curled into fists at her sides, shaking with something that was equal parts fury and fear. He's not wrong, she said quietly. About the sheriff, about the judge, about all of it. This whole valley runs on Grayson's money one way or another. Then we don't go through the valley, Caleb said. We go around it. Around it how? Territorial Marshal's office, Caleb said. 2 days' ride, but they're federal, not county. Grayson's money doesn't reach that far. Forged land documents and fraudulent notes, that's the kind of thing federal marshals take seriously, especially if there's a pattern to it, and not just one family's word against a rich man's. Abigail looked at him, something shifting behind her eyes. You'd ride 2 days to file a complaint on behalf of people you barely know. Wouldn't be the first hard ride I've made for something that mattered, Caleb said, and didn't explain further, and Abigail didn't ask because there was a version of his grief in that sentence she understood without needing the details spelled out. Word of the confrontation moved through Cedar Hollow, the way water moves through a cracked dam, slow at first, and then all at once. And by the following morning, half the town had an opinion about the mountain cowboy, who'd stood toe-to-toe with Silas Grayson inside Abigail Whitmore's store. Norma Wells arrived early, ostensibly for buttons, and did not bother pretending otherwise this time. Everyone's saying he called Grayson out, she said, eyes bright with the particular hunger of a woman who'd found gossip worth more than her usual supply. Right here in your store. He answered a threat, Abigail said. That's not the same as calling anyone out. They're saying he's sweet on you. They're saying a lot of things, Norma. Most of it isn't true. Is it true he lost a wife, a son too? Abigail's hands stilled on the counter. That's his business to share, not mine. I only ask because a man carrying that kind of grief, Norma said softer now, some of the sharpness draining out of her voice. Well, it changes a person. Makes them either harder or kinder depending on the man. Seems to me this one went the kinder way, which is rare enough to be worth noting. It was the closest thing to genuine warmth Abigail had heard from Norma Wells in 6 years, and it caught her off guard enough that she didn't have a sharp reply ready. He's a decent man, Abigail said finally. That's all I know for certain. That's more than most women in this town could say about the men in their lives, Norma said, and left with her buttons, and Abigail stood there wondering when exactly the ground beneath her had started shifting. The mini triumphs came in pieces over the following days, small and hard-won, the kind of victories that didn't make for dramatic telling, but mattered enormously to the people living them. Thomas Miller arrived with a genuine copy of his father's will, notarized 11 years back, that made no mention whatsoever of any outstanding loan against the property. Abigail filed it carefully alongside her growing collection of evidence, a folder now thick enough to need its own drawer behind the counter. A rancher named Whitfield came forward with a story nearly identical to the Millers. A forged debt materializing 18 months back that had forced him to sell 200 acres to Grayson at a fraction of its worth. And though Whitfield was too frightened to put his name to any complaint, he was willing to talk quietly, and Abigail wrote down every word. Curtis, the young ranch hand from the street confrontation days before, showed up at the store's back door one evening after closing hat in hand, looking younger and more uncertain than he had standing beside Boyd Caro, mocking Abigail's future. "Didn't want to be seen coming in the front," he said. "Boyd'd have my hide if he knew I was here." "What do you want, Curtis?" "To say I'm sorry." He said the words coming out fast, like he'd rehearsed them, and was afraid of losing his nerve. "For what I said in the street. Wasn't my place, and it wasn't even true half of it. My ma always said you kept her family fed through the winter. Her husband broke his leg and couldn't work the land. Never should have stood there laughing while Boyd said what he said." Abigail studied him for a long moment. "Why tell me now?" "Because I work for Grayson," Curtis said, dropping his voice. "And I heard him talking to his foreman 2 nights back. He's got another note ready. Bigger one this time. Says he's tired of waiting on smaller fish and means to come straight for the store next, once he's got enough weight behind him that nobody in town will dare stand against it." Abigail's stomach dropped. "Coming for the store? How—" "Didn't hear all of it," Curtis said. "But I heard your father's name. Heard something about a debt from before you took over the place. I don't know if it's true or forged like the Miller's note, but I know Grayson don't much care about the difference, so long as the paper looks official enough to hold up with Judge Pruitt." "Curtis." Abigail's voice had gone very quiet, very careful. "This could cost you your job. Could cost you worse if Grayson finds out you told me." "Figured that's a chance worth taking," Curtis said, twisting his hat in his hands. "Wasn't raised to stand by and watch a man ruin folks just because he can. My pa would have been ashamed of me standing in that street laughing along with Boyd. Don't aim to make him ashamed of me twice." He left before Abigail could properly thank him, disappearing into the dusk with the particular haste of a young man terrified of being caught doing the right thing. And Abigail closed the back door slowly, her mind racing through everything he'd just told her. She found Caleb at the edge of town near dusk, tending to his horse outside the small rented room he'd taken above the livery, and told him everything Curtis had said, the words tumbling out faster than she'd intended. "A note against your father." Caleb repeated, his hands going still on the horse's flank. "You certain there's nothing real behind it?" "My father never borrowed $1 in his life he couldn't pay back within the season," Abigail said. "He was proud that way almost to a fault. If Grayson's got a note with his signature on it, it's forged same as the Millers." "Then we're running out of time to wait on federal marshals 2 days right away," Caleb said. "If Grayson's building his case now, he could have Judge Pruitt sign off on a seizure inside the week." "I know. You scared?" Abigail opened her mouth to deny it, the old reflex rising fast, the same reflex that had kept her spine straight through 6 years of whispers and judgment. Then she stopped herself because there was something in the plain honesty of his question that deserved a plain, honest answer. "Terrified," she said. "I've spent 6 years building something out of nothing, Caleb. Dug the post holes myself. Went without to keep the shelves stocked through winters when nobody else would extend me credit. If Grayson takes it with a piece of forged paper and a bought judge, everything I've done disappears like it never mattered at all." "It'll always matter," Caleb said. "Piece of paper can take a building, can't take what you built inside yourself getting there." Something in her chest cracked open again, the 3rd time in as many days, and this time she didn't try to hide it behind sharp words or busy hands. "Why do you care this much?" she asked. "You've known me a week. You could ride back up that mountain tomorrow and never think of Cedar Hollow again." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting against the horse's neck, his eyes fixed somewhere past her. somewhere that looked like it belonged to a memory rather than the present moment. "After I lost Rachel and the boy," he said finally, "I told myself I was done caring about anything that could be taken from me. Figured if I didn't build anything, didn't want anything, wasn't nothing left for the world to take. Lived that way 6 years. Told myself it was peace. Wasn't peace. Was just a slower kind of dying. And now I watched a woman stand in a street and refuse to apologize for surviving," he said. "Watched her keep half a valley fed through winters that should have broken her. Watched her fight a man with more money and more power because it was the right thing to do, even when everybody around her was too scared to do the same. Man forgets living alone on a mountain that there's still people in the world worth caring about. You reminded me of that. Don't rightly know how to thank you for it except to make sure Grayson doesn't take away the thing that reminded me." Abigail didn't trust her voice enough to answer that properly, so she reached out instead and took his hand, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the calluses there that matched her own two people who'd built their strength the same hard way, and neither one of them said anything more about it because some things didn't need saying out loud to be understood. The next blow came faster and harder than either of them expected. Abigail arrived at the store 2 mornings later to find the front window shattered glass scattered across the boardwalk, and inside 3 crates of goods overturned and ruined flour dusted across the floor like snow, coffee beans scattered and crushed underfoot. She stood in the doorway, hand pressed to her mouth, and for one long moment felt 6 years of careful hard-won stability crack straight down the middle. Caleb arrived within minutes, drawn by the commotion, and found her kneeling among the ruined stock, gathering what could still be salvaged with hands that shook despite her best effort to steady them. "Grayson," she said before he could ask. "Has to be. Nobody else in this town would dare." "No note left behind? No message?" "Doesn't need one," Abigail said. "This is the message, reminding me what fragile arrangements he was talking about." Sheriff Daniels came by an hour later, took a slow walk around the broken glass, and offered the kind of shrug that told Abigail everything she needed to know about how far his investigation would go. "Could have been anybody," he said. "Drunk cowhands, probably. Happens sometimes on a Friday night." "It's Tuesday, Sheriff." "Could have been kids then. Territory's full of mischief this time of year." "You know exactly whose mischief this was," Abigail said, and Sheriff Daniels had the decency to look uncomfortable, though not decent enough to actually do anything about it. After he left, Caleb helped her board up the broken window with lumber from the livery, working in silence for a long while before he finally spoke. "This isn't going to stop," he said. "Not with broken glass, not with forged notes. Man like Grayson, he's testing how much you can take before you break. Every time you don't break, he escalates. So what do I do? Break so he stops?" "No," Caleb said, hammering the last board into place with more force than strictly necessary. "You get ahead of him, instead of always reacting to whatever he throws at you next. We've got Curtis's word, the Miller's forged note Whitfield story, and now a broken window that Sheriff Daniels won't investigate proper. That's a pattern, Abigail. Patterns are exactly what a federal marshal needs to open a real case, one Grayson's money can't touch." "You still mean to ride out?" "Tomorrow," Caleb said. 2 days there, 2 days back if the weather holds. I'll bring the marshal's office everything we've got. In the meantime, I sit here alone while Grayson throws worse than broken glass through my window." Abigail finished. "Not alone," Caleb said. "I'll ask Curtis to keep watch nights quiet-like so nobody knows he's doing it. And there's a man I trust in the next valley over retired marshal himself owes me a favor from years back. I'll have him ride in and stay near while I'm gone." "You've thought this through. Thought about little else since Grayson walked through your door talking about fragile arrangements," Caleb admitted, and something in the admission landed heavier than he probably intended, because it told her plainly how much space she'd already come to occupy in a mind that had spent 6 years determined to occupy no space with anyone at all. That night, after the store had been swept and boarded and the ruined stock hauled away, Abigail sat on the back step with a lantern beside her, and Caleb found her there when he came to check the window's repairs held steady against the wind. "You should be resting," he said. Long day tomorrow riding out. Can't sleep, Abigail said. Every time I close my eyes, I see that window shattered. 6 years, and it took him one night to remind me how fragile it all still is. Caleb sat down beside her on the step close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while, neither of them said anything at all. Tell me about her, Abigail said finally. Your wife, if you want to. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse, might close off the way men so often did when a wound sat too close to the surface. Rachel, he said eventually. Laughed easy. Laughed at things that weren't even funny just because she liked the sound of her own laughing. Boy took after her that way. Named him Daniel, after her father. He was 4 when the fever took them both. 4 years old, and he already had her laugh. I'm sorry. Everybody says that, Caleb said not unkindly. Never quite know what to say back. Ain't your fault. Ain't nobody's fault, not really, except maybe God's, and I gave up trying to make sense of that a long while back. Is that why you went to the mountain, to get away from a God you were angry with? Went to the mountain because I couldn't stand a single room in that house without seeing them in it, Caleb said. Rachel's kitchen, Daniel's little bed by the window. Every corner of that place had a ghost in it. Man can't grieve proper surrounded by ghosts. Figured empty was better. Turns out empty's its own kind of haunting, just quieter. And now, he looked at her, then in the lantern light. Something raw and unguarded moving across his face that she hadn't seen from him before, not even in the street facing down Boyd Caro, not even facing Grayson across her own counter. Now I ride 2 days to a federal marshal's office for a woman who told me flat out she doesn't need saving, he said. Which tells me something's changed in me I wasn't expecting to change. Don't rightly know what to call it yet. Scares me some if I'm honest. Losing something once about broke me clean in half. Don't know that I could survive losing something twice. I'm not asking you to risk that, Abigail said quietly. Didn't say you asked, Caleb said. Said I'm choosing it anyway, same as I told you before. There's a difference. He reached over then and took her hand the same way she'd taken his 2 nights before, and this time neither of them let go for a long while, sitting together on the back step in the lantern light, while the boarded window creaked faintly in the wind. Behind them, 2 people who'd both built walls out of loss, and were only now slowly, carefully beginning to consider what it might mean to let somebody help carry the weight of holding them up. Caleb rode out before dawn the next morning, a note of introduction to the marshal's office folded carefully in his saddlebag, alongside copies of every piece of evidence Abigail had gathered, and Abigail stood on the boardwalk watching him go, until he'd disappeared past the last bend in the road, feeling a hollow ache settle into her chest that she recognized uneasily as something close to fear for a person other than herself. A feeling she hadn't allowed since she'd buried her father. The retired marshal Caleb had spoken of arrived that same afternoon, a weathered man named Hutch, with a limp in his left leg and eyes that missed nothing, and took up quiet residence in the room above the livery, without drawing any particular attention to himself, exactly as Caleb had promised. Curtis kept his watch each night hidden in the shadows across from the store and reported each morning that nothing had stirred, though his face carried the strain of a young man sneaking out against his employer's knowledge, terrified of discovery. For 2 days, Cedar Hollow held an uneasy, watchful quiet, the whole town aware that something was building, even if most of them didn't know the shape of it yet. Then, on the 3rd morning, Grayson returned to the store himself, and this time his composure had abandoned him entirely. "Where is he?" Grayson demanded, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the newly repaired window. "Where's who, Mr. Grayson?" "Your mountain man, Stone. I know he rode out 2 days back. I have men who watch the roads out of this valley. Miss Whitmore, same as I have men who watch everything else that concerns my interests. Then your men can tell you as well as I can where he's gone," Abigail said, keeping her voice level, despite the hammering of her own heart. "He's gone to the marshal's office," Grayson said, and it wasn't a question. "Filing a complaint, bringing federal attention down on affairs that are none of the federal government's concern. Forged notes and shattered windows sound like exactly the federal government's concern to me. Grayson crossed the distance between them fast enough that Abigail took an instinctive step back, her hand finding the edge of the counter behind her. "You think a federal marshal changes anything?" He said, his voice low now, dangerous in a way it hadn't been before, all pretense of civility finally stripped away. "I have held this valley in my hand for 15 years, Miss Whitmore. I have survived worse than one mountain cowboy and one stubborn shopkeeper playing detective with old bank letters. By the time any marshal rides back into this territory, the paperwork on your father's debt will already be filed with Judge Pruitt. The seizure will already be underway, and you will already have lost everything you have spent 6 years building. There is nothing you can do to stop what is already in motion." "Then why are you here shouting at me instead of celebrating your victory?" Abigail said, forcing steel into her voice, even as her stomach twisted with dread. Grayson's jaw worked, and for just a moment the mask slipped entirely, revealing something closer to genuine fury underneath. "Because I don't like loose ends, Miss Whitmore, and you and your mountain man have become the loosest end I've had to deal with in 15 years. He turned and left without another word, the bell ringing hollow and ominous behind him, and Abigail stood alone in her store with her heart pounding, replaying his words, already filed, already underway, already lost, and felt the full weight of everything she'd built, teetering on the edge of a cliff she couldn't see the bottom of. Hutch found her 20 minutes later, still standing frozen behind the counter, and listened in grim silence as she recounted the confrontation. "He's scared," Hutch said when she finished. "Man like that don't come shouting into a shop unless something's slipping out of his control. Marshall's office being involved, that's exactly the kind of thing that slips control from a man like Grayson. He said the paperwork's already being filed, said the seizure's already underway." "Could be true," Hutch said. "Could be bluster meant to break your nerve before Caleb gets back with real help. Either way, we don't sit here waiting to find out which. I know Judge Pruitt a little from my marshal days. Man's beholden to Grayson, sure, but he's not stupid, and he's not entirely without a conscience buried under all that beholden. There's still time to get ahead of this if we move careful and fast." "How? You said you've got copies of everything," Hutch said. "The forged Miller note, Whitfield story, whatever you can find on your own father's supposed debt. I say we take it straight to Judge Pruitt ourselves before Grayson's paperwork lands on his desk. Man might be beholden, but he won't want to be seen signing off on something this crooked if there's already a federal marshal's office looking into the pattern." "That's a risk," Abigail said. "If Pruitt's already decided to side with Grayson, we'd be walking straight into his hands, showing him exactly what we've got before Caleb's even back with federal backing." "It's a risk," Hutch agreed. "But sitting here doing nothing while Grayson's paperwork gets filed is a bigger one. Man told you himself, Miss Whitmore. Already in motion. That's not a threat for later, that's a threat for now." Abigail looked down at her hands, steady now despite everything, and thought of her father's post holes dug with these same hands, thought of 6 years of proving to a town that had already decided who she was, that she could survive anything they threw at her. "All right," she said. "We go to Judge Pruitt. Tonight before Grayson can file anything else." "That's the spirit," Hutch said, though his weathered face carried a grimness that told her he understood, even if he wouldn't say it plainly, that they were about to gamble everything on the thin hope that one bought judge still had enough conscience left to matter. They found Judge Pruitt at his home just past sundown, a modest house at the edge of town that seemed almost deliberately plain for a man who held so much power over the valley's affairs. And Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she knocked through her voice. When the door opened, came out steady. "Judge Pruitt, I need a few minutes of your time. It concerns Silas Grayson, and it concerns evidence I believe you'll want to see before any paperwork of his crosses your desk." Pruitt was an older man, silver-haired, with tired eyes that studied her for a long moment, before flicking to Hutch, standing just behind her shoulder. "You're the shopkeeper," he said. "Whitmore, and you're former Marshal Hutchins, unless I'm mistaken." "You're not mistaken, Judge," Hutch said. Pruitt was quiet a moment longer, and Abigail held her breath, uncertain whether the next words out of his mouth would send them away, or let them in, uncertain whether this entire gamble had been the right choice or a catastrophic mistake. Then Pruitt stepped back from the door, holding it open. "You'd best come in," he said, "before somebody sees you standing on my porch after dark and decides to make something of it." Abigail stepped through the doorway, with Hutch close behind her, the folder of evidence clutched tight against her chest, and felt for the first time since Grayson had stormed out of her store that morning, something that might have been the thinnest thread of hope. But even as she sat down across from Judge Pruitt in his modest parlor, laying out the forged Miller note beside the bank letters that proved it false, laying out Whitfield's quiet testimony, laying out every scrap of pattern she and Caleb had built together over the past week, a small cold voice in the back of her mind reminded her that Caleb was still 2 days from home, that Grayson's paperwork might already be moving faster than any of them could counter, and that somewhere out there in the dark, a man who had already proven he didn't stop at broken windows was watching and waiting and deciding exactly how far he was willing to go to make sure Abigail Whitmore lost everything before her mountain cowboy ever made it back to stand beside her. Judge Pruitt studied the papers for a long time before he said anything at all. His silver head bent low over the lamplight, his finger tracing the signature on the forged Miller note again and again, like he was hoping it might change if he looked at it long enough. "This isn't Franklin Miller's hand," he said finally. "I signed enough deeds alongside that man to know his mark." He crossed his T's low and hard like he was driving nails. "This signature crosses high soft. Whoever forged this never once watched the man write his own name." "Then you'll refuse to sign off on Grayson's claim," Abigail said, hope rising fast and dangerous in her chest. Pruitt set the paper down slowly, and something tired and old moved across his face. "It isn't that simple, Miss Whitmore." "Why not? You just said yourself the signature's false." "Because I owe the bank that holds my own ranch's mortgage more money than I care to admit," Pruitt said. "And that bank answers to men who answer to Silas Grayson. I don't say that to excuse myself. I say it so you understand exactly what you're asking of me. You're asking a man to risk his own land, his own family's future against a man who has already proven he doesn't stop at broken windows." The room went very quiet. "So you'll sign it?" Abigail said, her voice flat, the hope draining back out of her as fast as it had come. "You'll sign whatever paper Grayson brings you, knowing it's built on lies because you're afraid of what happens if you don't." "I didn't say that either." Pruitt's eyes came up sharper now, some old steel showing through the tiredness. "I said it isn't simple. There's a difference between afraid and stupid, Miss Whitmore, and I have spent 15 years being the first without quite managing to be the second. I can't refuse Grayson outright. Man would ruin me inside a month and find some other judge more willing besides. But I can delay. I can find procedural questions in this note that require review. I can insist on independent verification of the signature before I'll authorize any seizure. That buys you time, not justice. Time. How much time? A week, perhaps 10 days, if I'm thorough about it, and nobody above me starts asking why an old judge has suddenly grown so careful about his paperwork." Pruitt looked at her steadily. "Your mountain man is riding to the federal marshal's office, I understand." "He is." "Then pray he rides fast," Pruitt said, "because 10 days is the very outside of what I can manage, and Silas Grayson does not take kindly to delay." Hutch, silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke. "It's more than we had an hour ago, Judge. We're obliged." "Don't be obliged," Pruitt said, something bitter in it. "Be careful instead. And Miss Whitmore." He paused, weighing the words. "Whatever happens in the coming days, you should know there are more people in this valley who see what Grayson's doing than you might think. Most of them are simply too frightened to say so out loud. Doesn't make the seeing any less real." Abigail left the judge's house with the folder clutched to her chest and Hutch's steady presence beside her in the dark, and for the first time in days, she let herself believe just barely that they might survive this. That belief lasted exactly until morning. The knock at Abigail's door came before sunrise, hard and urgent, and she opened it to find Sarah Miller standing there again. Except this time, there was no boy on her hip, only raw terror stripped bare across her face. "They've taken Thomas," Sarah said. "Grayson's men, middle of the night. Said he assaulted one of Grayson's foremen, said he's being held for the circuit judge when he comes through next month. Abigail Thomas didn't touch anybody. He was asleep beside me when they dragged him out." "That's not possible. Nobody witnessed—" "Two of Grayson's own hands are swearing they saw it," Sarah said. "Course they are. They work for the man. What's their word worth against a rich man's paycheck?" Abigail felt the floor shift under her. The careful 10 days Pruitt had bought, suddenly meaningless if Grayson had simply decided to remove Thomas Miller from the equation entirely, one manufactured crime at a time. "This isn't about the note anymore," she said slowly. "This is a message. He's showing everyone in the valley exactly what happens to families who don't fall in line." "What do I do?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I've got 3 children and a husband sitting in a jail cell for something he never did." "You wait," Abigail said, though the words tasted hollow even as she said them. "Judge Pruitt bought us time on the note itself. I'll go to him again, ask him to look into these charges as well." "And if Grayson's already got the sheriff's cooperation on this too?" Abigail didn't have an answer for that, because she already knew with sick certainty that Sheriff Daniels would sign whatever paper Grayson put in front of him the same way he'd shrugged off her shattered window 3 days before. Curtis found her at the store an hour later, and one look at his face told her something else had gone wrong before he even opened his mouth. "Boyd knows," he said, breathless, like he'd run the whole way. "Somebody saw me leaving here 2 nights back after my watch. Told Boyd, and Boyd told the foreman, and the foreman fired me this morning. Said Grayson don't keep snakes on his payroll. Curtis, I'm sorry. Ain't your fault," he said, though his voice shook. "Chose it myself, same as you said. But that ain't the worst of it." He glanced over his shoulder, checking the street, before continuing low and fast. "I heard the foreman talking before he let me go. Grayson's not waiting on any note against your father anymore. Says he's found a faster way. Says by tomorrow evening he'll have a fresh order from a circuit judge 2 counties over, one that owes him plenty and won't ask half the questions Pruitt's asking. Says he means to have men here at first light day after tomorrow to clear the store out himself, paper or no paper fully settled yet, and dare anybody in this town to stop him." Abigail's hands went cold. "That's not legal. He can't simply seize property without—" "Since when has legal mattered to a man who owns half the officials meant to enforce it?" Curtis said. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. Truly I am. Wish I had better news to bring you." He left before she could think of anything to say, and Abigail stood alone in her store, the same store she'd built with her own 2 hands over 6 long years, and felt something close to despair, creeping in at the edges of her resolve for the first time since this whole nightmare had begun. 2 days. Grayson meant to take everything in 2 days, and Caleb was still at least a full day from the marshal's office, with a full day's ride back after that, even if the marshal agreed to help immediately, which was no guarantee at all. The rumor started that same afternoon, and Abigail didn't know at first where it had come from, only that by the time it reached her ears second-hand through a customer too embarrassed to say it to her face directly, it had already taken on the particular shape and weight of something Grayson had crafted deliberately. They were saying Caleb Stone hadn't ridden out for any marshal at all. They were saying he'd simply left the way. Men like that always eventually left spooked by a woman too much trouble to keep, and that Abigail had invented the story of a marshal's errand to save face in front of a town that had already predicted this exact outcome from the very beginning. "Too much for any man to stay," Norma Wells repeated to her, not unkindly, this time more like a woman warning a friend of a storm she could see building on the horizon. "That's what they're saying, dear. I don't believe it myself, mind you. But it's spreading fast, and spreading fast is usually enough in this town whether it's true or not." "He's coming back," Abigail said, and heard even as she said it the small tremor of doubt beneath her own certainty, because 6 years of being left, of being warned, of being told no man would choose her, had carved a groove in her that even Caleb's steadiness hadn't fully smoothed away. "I hope you're right," Norma said. "For your sake, and for the whole valley's given what I'm hearing about Grayson's plans for tomorrow." Word of the impending seizure had apparently already begun to spread as well, and Cedar Hollow's particular flavor of nervous energy hung thick in the air. All through that long afternoon. Shopkeepers glancing toward Abigail's store with expressions caught somewhere between sympathy and the particular relief of people grateful the trouble had landed on someone else's doorstep instead of their own. That night alone above the darkened store, with Hutch keeping careful watch outside, Abigail sat with the lantern turned low and let herself finally feel the full weight of everything pressing down on her. What if the rumors were true? Some small, cruel voice whispered inside her. What if Caleb had simply ridden off into the mountains, the way men always eventually did, and the marshal's errand had been nothing but a kind excuse, a soft way of leaving a woman too proud and too difficult to stay tethered to? What if Boyd Caro had been right in the street that very first day? What if she truly was too much, too hard, too proud to be loved by anyone who didn't have his own reasons for staying? Reasons that could just as easily send him riding away the moment things grew difficult. She thought of her father, dead 6 years now. The only person who had ever loved her, without conditions attached, without some quiet expectation that she soften herself into something smaller and easier to hold. She thought of the letter she'd burned 3 winters back, the man in Bozeman, who'd withdrawn his proposal the moment his mother voiced her disapproval. She thought of every single person in this valley who had decided long before they ever truly knew her exactly what kind of woman she was and exactly what kind of loneliness she deserved. And for the first time in 6 long years, sitting alone in the near dark with everything she'd built, hanging by the thinnest thread, Abigail Whitmore let herself cry. Not loud, not long, just enough to release some fraction of the pressure that had been building since that very first morning. In the street, tears sliding silent down her face while she sat with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them like a much younger woman. Like the girl she'd been before the world had taught her that vulnerability was a door other people walked through to hurt you. She didn't hear Hutch's soft knock until the second time. Miss Whitmore. His voice through the door was careful, gentle, in a way that surprised her from a man built like a fence post. Rider coming in fast from the East Road. Wanted you to know before you heard hooves in the dark and thought the worst. Abigail wiped her face hurriedly and opened the door. Grayson's men. Don't think so, Hutch said. Too fast, too reckless for men being careful about an ambush. Man riding like that's either running from something or running toward it hard enough not to care what waits at the other end. They stood together in the dark, listening, and the hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until a lathered horse came around the bend at a pace that seemed likely to break its own legs on the uneven road, and Abigail's heart climbed into her throat even before she could make out the rider clearly in the dim moonlight. Caleb. He pulled the horse up hard enough that it reared slightly, already swinging down before the animal had fully settled, and crossed the distance between them at a near run. You're not supposed to be back until tomorrow at the earliest? Abigail said, her voice unsteady with relief and confusion both. Wasn't going to be, Caleb said, breathing hard. But I met the marshal's deputy on the road not 6 hours out from here, already heading this direction on other business entirely. Some land dispute up near the Cooper place. And when I told him what was happening in Cedar Hollow, he agreed to ride ahead of schedule. He's a day behind me, maybe less, if he pushes his horse the way I pushed mine. But Abigail... He stopped, searching her face in the lantern light, something urgent and afraid moving behind his eyes. There's something else. Something I need to tell you before Grayson does, because I have a feeling he already knows, and he's the kind of man who'd use it against both of us if he got the chance first. The cold dread that had been sitting in Abigail's stomach all evening deepened into something sharper. What is it? Caleb's jaw tightened. On my way back, I stopped at a way station about half a day out. Man there recognized my name, said a fella had come through 2 days back, asking after me, asking about a mountain ranch. 2 days' ride from Cedar Hollow, asking whether the deed was clear or whether there was any debt attached to it. Abigail, that ranch was mine and Rachel's before I moved up to the high country. There's an old note against it from before she died. Medical bills mostly, from doctors who couldn't save her or the boy anyway. I paid most of it down over the years, but there's still a piece outstanding small enough I never worried on it. Grayson, Abigail breathed. Grayson, Caleb confirmed. Man's been asking questions about buying up that old note. Small as it is, if he holds it, he's got a claim against my land, the same way he's got a false claim against yours. Reckon that's meant to be leverage. Meant to make me choose between staying here, fighting for you, and riding back to protect what's mine before he finds a way to take that too. Abigail felt something twist painfully in her chest. Then you should go. Protect what's yours. I won't ask you to lose everything on my account, not after everything you've already— Stop. Caleb's voice cut through hers firm, but not unkind. I didn't ride 6 hours in the dark near killing my horse to hear you try and talk me into leaving. Grayson wants me choosing between you and my land, because he thinks a man who's already lost everything once will always choose the safer bet, the thing he can hold on to, without risking his heart on it again. He's wrong about me. I already told you that. Man's got nothing left to threaten me with. That scares me more than watching another person I care about get ground down by somebody else's greed while I stand by safe on my mountain telling myself it isn't my fight. Caleb. Marshall's deputy is a day out, Caleb said, cutting through whatever she'd been about to say, his hand finding hers in the dark, steady, despite the exhaustion clearly written across every line of his face. We hold through tomorrow. We hold through whatever Grayson throws at us, and then we finish this together the way we started it. Morning brought Silas Grayson himself, flanked by 4 hired men, and a document he waved with theatrical confidence as he strode down the middle of Main Street toward Abigail's store, and word of his approach spread through Cedar Hollow fast enough that a crowd had already begun gathering by the time he reached her door, drawn by the same hunger for spectacle that had brought them out into the street 8 days before to watch Abigail confront Boyd Caro. Caleb stood beside her on the boardwalk, Hutch a few steps behind, and Abigail felt the whole town's attention settling over her like a physical weight as Grayson stopped in front of them, his practiced smile back in full force now that he believed victory was finally within reach. Miss Whitmore, he said loud enough to carry to the gathering crowd. I have here a properly executed order from Judge Coleman of the 3rd District authorizing immediate seizure of this property in satisfaction of an outstanding debt owed by your late father's estate. I've brought men to begin the process this morning peaceably, if you're wise enough to allow it. Judge Coleman's district doesn't include Cedar Hollow, Abigail said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the tremor she felt building underneath it. You know that as well as I do. Judge Coleman's district includes any matter properly filed and transferred to his jurisdiction, Grayson said smoothly. Which this has given certain irregularities in how Judge Pruitt has been handling the case. Irregularities I've been forced to bring to the attention of the territorial court. You mean Judge Pruitt refused to simply rubber stamp your forged note? Caleb said, stepping half a pace forward. So you went shopping for a judge 2 counties over who'd never met Franklin Miller's actual signature and wouldn't know a forgery if it bit him. A murmur moved through the crowd, and Abigail saw a few faces shift uncertain now, the story wobbling slightly under the weight of Caleb's plain accusation. Careful, Mr. Stone, Grayson said, his smile tightening at the edges. Slander is a serious charge in this territory, and I have considerably more resources than you do to pursue it. Ain't slander if it's true, Caleb said. And it is true. Same as the note against Thomas Miller was forged, same as your foreman lied about him assaulting anybody so you could lock him up and scare the rest of this valley into silence. Boyd Caro, standing near the front of the crowd, shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, Abigail saw genuine doubt crack across the face of one of Grayson's own men. Grayson noticed it too, and something in his expression sharpened with irritation. Enough of this theater. Miss Whitmore, you may either vacate this property peacefully, allowing me to conduct an orderly transfer, or my men will begin removing your stock regardless of your cooperation. I would strongly advise the former. Hutch stepped forward, then, his weathered voice cutting clean through the tension. Territorial Marshal's deputy is a day out from Cedar Hollow. Grayson rode in this direction on other business entirely, but he'll be interested plenty once he hears what's happened here. Federal complaints have already been filed regarding a pattern of forged land claims across this valley. Your name features prominently. For the first time, something like genuine uncertainty flickered across Grayson's composed features. Federal marshals have no jurisdiction over a territorial land dispute. They've got jurisdiction over mail fraud, forged federal land patents, and a pattern of documented extortion across county lines, Hutch said. I spent 20 years as a marshal myself, Grayson. I know exactly what falls under federal jurisdiction, and everything you've done in this valley over the past 2 years falls square within it. If somebody's willing to build the case proper, somebody has. The crowd's murmur grew louder now, uncertain whispers rippling backward through the gathered townspeople, and Abigail watched heart-hammering as the story Grayson had spent 2 years carefully constructing began for the first time to show real cracks in front of the very town he'd used it to control. "This is absurd," Grayson said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier command. "I have a legal order in my hand signed by a sitting judge, a judge who's never once set foot in this county and wouldn't know Franklin Miller's signature from his own," Caleb said. "You want to seize this store on paper that thin in front of this many witnesses with a federal deputy riding in tomorrow to hear every word of it. Go ahead, Grayson. See how that story holds up when somebody with real authority starts asking real questions." For a long moment, Grayson said nothing at all, his eyes flicking across the crowd, calculating, recalculating the particular arithmetic of a man who had built his entire empire on the assumption that nobody would ever have the resources or the courage to truly challenge him. Then his gaze landed on Norma Wells, standing near the front of the crowd with her arms crossed and an expression Abigail had never quite seen on her before. "Mrs. Wells," Grayson said, reaching for some last card to play, "surely you of all people understand what kind of woman we're discussing here. You've said yourself many times that Miss Whitmore is—" "I've said a great many foolish things about Abigail Whitmore over the years," Norma said, her voice cutting through the street with unexpected force. "And I've had considerable time this past week to reconsider most of them. She's fed half this valley through winters that should have broken us all. She's been standing in that street for over a week now fighting a war most of us were too frightened to even acknowledge was happening. And near as I can tell, Mr. Grayson, the only person in Cedar Hollow who's actually behaved shamefully through this entire affair is you." The crowd fell utterly silent. Abigail stared at Norma, stunned, something warm and unexpected breaking through the fear that had gripped her chest all morning. Grayson's composure finally visibly cracked. "This is precisely the kind of hysteria a woman like Whitmore provokes when she doesn't get her way. Mrs. Wells, you've known me for— I've known you long enough to recognize a man protesting too hard when he's caught doing wrong," Norma said. "Now either show us proof that Judge Coleman's order is legitimate and properly filed, or take your men and your paper and get off this street before the whole town watches you try to steal from a woman who's done nothing but earn every single thing she has." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, now small, at first a few voices, then more, and Abigail watched with something close to disbelief as the town that had spent 6 years deciding who she was began in real time to reconsider that verdict. Grayson's men shifted uneasily behind him, clearly unprepared for a crowd turning hostile toward their employer rather than the woman they'd come to dispossess. "This isn't finished," Grayson said, his voice low, now venomous, all pretense of civility finally abandoned entirely. "I have resources none of you can imagine, and I promise you, Miss Whitmore, this town's momentary sympathy will not save you from what comes next." "Maybe not," Caleb said, stepping forward until he stood directly between Grayson and Abigail. His voice quiet, but carrying an edge of steel that silenced whatever else Grayson might have said. "But it buys us the one thing you never accounted for, Grayson: time. And time's exactly what a federal marshal needs to build a case thorough enough that even your money can't bury it." Grayson stood there a long moment, his 4 hired men shifting uncertainly behind him, the crowd's mood having shifted decisively against him, and something in his face suggested a man recalculating an equation he'd been certain of only minutes before. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back down Main Street, his men trailing uncertainly behind him, and the crowd watched him go, in a silence that felt for the first time in this entire nightmare like something closer to victory than defeat. But Abigail, watching Grayson's retreating back, felt no relief at all. Because a man like Silas Grayson didn't simply walk away when he lost a public confrontation. He went home to plan something worse. The attack came that night, and it came for Caleb. Abigail heard the commotion from her window above the store shouts and the sharp crack of gunfire somewhere near the livery, and her heart seized with a terror sharper than anything Grayson's threats had produced all week. She ran through the dark streets, Hutch close behind her with his revolver drawn, and found Caleb on the ground outside the livery stable, blood soaking through his shirt at the shoulder. 3 of Grayson's hired men scattered around him. 2 fled into the darkness, and 1 groaning on the ground where Caleb had apparently put him before the gunshot took him down. "Caleb!" Abigail dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed against the wound, warm blood slicking her fingers. "Caleb, stay with me. Don't you dare." "Ain't planning on going anywhere." Caleb ground out through clenched teeth, though his face had gone pale in the moonlight. 3 of them. Waited till I came out to check on the horses. Should have expected it, honestly. Man like Grayson doesn't lose a public argument without trying something uglier in the dark after. "We need a doctor," Hutch said, already moving, already shouting for someone to fetch Doc Williams. "Grayson did this," Abigail said, fury and terror twisting together in her chest as she pressed harder against Caleb's shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding. "He sent men to kill you." "Didn't manage it," Caleb said, and despite everything, despite the blood and the pain evident in every line of his face, something almost like a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Told you. Man's got nothing left in me that scares easy." "This isn't funny, Caleb Stone." "No, ma'am." He agreed, wincing as Doc Williams arrived and began cutting away the ruined shirt to examine the wound properly. "Ain't funny at all. But I'll tell you what it is. It's proof. Grayson's desperate enough now to try murdering a man in the street, rather than let a federal marshal ask him a single question. That's not the action of an innocent man defending a legal claim, Abigail. That's the action of a man who knows exactly how much he stands to lose." Doc Williams worked quickly, his experienced hands finding the bullet, and though Caleb's jaw clenched hard enough to show the strain, he never once cried out, watching Abigail's face the entire time, like her presence was the only anchor keeping him steady through the pain. "Bullet missed anything vital," Doc Williams said, finally tying off the last stitch. "He'll need rest, but he'll heal clean if infection doesn't set in. Man's lucky. Half an inch different, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." Abigail sat beside Caleb through the rest of that long night, her hand wrapped tight around his good one, watching him drift in and out of pained, exhausted sleep, and felt something crystallize inside her that had been building slowly since that very first morning in the street, 8 days before. She had spent 6 years telling herself she needed no one, that strength meant standing entirely alone, that love was a door. Other people used to hurt you the moment you let your guard down enough to walk through it. Watching Caleb Stone bleed on the ground outside a livery stable because he'd chosen again and again to stand beside her against a man with more money and more power than either of them could match. Alone, she understood with sudden and devastating clarity that she had been wrong about all of it. Strength wasn't standing alone. Strength was choosing to stand beside someone else, even when it cost you everything. Even when the world told you that you were too much for anyone to bother staying for. "You're not leaving," she said quietly, sometime near dawn, when his eyes finally opened again, clearer now, some of the pain having eased with rest. "Wasn't planning to," Caleb said, his voice rough. "I mean after this. After the marshal comes, after whatever happens with Grayson gets settled one way or the other. I mean, you're not riding back to that mountain and disappearing the way everyone in this town assumed you would from the very first day." Caleb studied her face for a long moment, something raw and searching in his exhausted eyes. "That what you want, Abigail? Because I need to hear you say it plain, not out of gratitude for tonight, not out of fear of being alone again. I need to know it's what you actually want, same as I need you to know it's what I actually want too. I've spent 6 years convinced I didn't need anyone," Abigail said, her voice unsteady but certain. "I still don't need anyone, Caleb. But I want you. There's a difference, same as you told me that very first week. And I don't want to spend one more day pretending that difference doesn't matter." Outside, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to creep over Cedar Hollow, and somewhere on the eastern road, a federal marshal's deputy was drawing closer with every passing hour, carrying with him the weight of everything that had happened in this small mountain town over the past 9 days. But inside that small room above the livery, with Caleb's hand tight around hers, and blood still drying dark on the floor, where he'd nearly died, defending something neither of them had expected to find. Abigail Whitmore understood that whatever Silas Grayson still had planned, whatever fight remained ahead of them, she would not be facing any of it alone. Not anymore. Caleb was still asleep when the federal deputy rode into Cedar Hollow just past noon, a full day ahead of Hutch's estimate, his horse lathered and his coat gray with trail dust, and word of his arrival moved through town faster than any gunfire had the night before. Abigail met him outside the livery, her dress still stained faintly with blood. She hadn't had time to properly wash out, and the deputy, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Reeves, took one look at her face and didn't bother with pleasantries. "I understand there was a shooting here last night," he said. "3 of Silas Grayson's hired men attacked Caleb Stone outside this livery," Abigail said. "He's alive, barely. Doc Williams pulled a bullet out of his shoulder before dawn." Reeves's jaw tightened. "That corroborates what I've already heard on the road in. Man back at the way station told me a rider matching Stone's description came through 2 days back, asking urgent questions about federal jurisdiction over forged land claims. Given what you're telling me now, I'd say somebody didn't take kindly to that inquiry." "There's more than the shooting," Abigail said. "Forged notes against at least 3 families in this valley, including my own father's estate. A man wrongfully jailed on manufactured assault charges. A judge 2 counties over signing off on claims he's got no real jurisdiction to sign. I have documentation on all of it." "Then I'd like to see every piece of it," Reeves said, "starting now before anyone has the chance to make evidence disappear the way they apparently tried to make a witness disappear last night." They gathered in the back room of Abigail's store. Within the hour, the same room that had, over the past week, become something like a war room, papers spread across a table that usually held nothing more dramatic than shipping manifests and supply orders. Reeves worked through the documents methodically, his questions sharp and precise, and Abigail found herself grateful watching him for the particular relief of finally speaking to someone whose authority Grayson's money couldn't simply purchase or intimidate away. "This signature," Reeves said, tapping the Miller note, "you're certain it doesn't match bank records?" "I have letters from 2 separate banks in neighboring counties confirming Franklin Miller never took out any loan against that property," Abigail said. "Judge Pruitt examined the note himself 2 nights back and said the same. Said Franklin Miller crossed his T's low and hard. This signature crosses high and soft. Whoever forged it never watched the man actually write." "And the assault charge against Thomas Miller. 2 of Grayson's own hired hands are swearing they witnessed it," Hutch said, arriving with fresh coffee and settling into the conversation with the ease of a man who'd spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of work. Convenient timing given it happened the same week Miss Whitmore started gathering evidence on the forged note. "I'd wager good money those 2 witnesses were paid considerably more than their usual wages this particular month." Reeves made a note, his expression giving away nothing, though something in the set of his shoulders had grown noticeably more focused with every fresh piece of evidence laid in front of him. "And the ranch note against Stone," he said. "The one you mentioned on the ride in. Old debt from before his wife passed," Abigail said, careful to keep her voice steady, even as the mention of Caleb sent a fresh wave of worry through her. "Small amount mostly paid down. Word is, Grayson's been trying to buy it up as leverage, same pattern as everything else. Man collects debts like other people collect grudges, then uses them to squeeze whoever he wants to control." "How many families total in your estimation?" Abigail exchanged a glance with Hutch. "We know of 4 confirmed. Whitfield lost 200 acres 18 months back to a note that appeared out of nowhere. The Coopers and the Delaney's, according to town rumor, though neither family stayed in the valley long enough afterward for anyone to ask them directly. And now the Millers, and possibly Caleb, if Grayson manages to purchase that old debt before anyone stops him. That's not a business dispute," Reeves said quietly. "That's a pattern of systematic fraud spanning multiple years and multiple victims, with last night's shooting suggesting the man's willing to escalate to attempted murder when his usual methods stop working. That's more than enough for me to open a full federal investigation, effective immediately." Relief flooded through Abigail so fast, it left her momentarily dizzy. What happens now? Now I ride out to speak with Judge Pruitt myself, get his account of the note's irregularities on official record. Reeves said, already gathering the documents into a leather case. Then I want to speak with this Whitfield you mentioned, and anyone else willing to go on record. And I want to see whatever jail Thomas Miller is currently sitting in, because a man held on manufactured charges to silence a witness is exactly the kind of thing that turns a fraud investigation into something considerably more serious. Caleb woke that afternoon to find Abigail sitting beside his bed, her hand still resting near his on the blanket, and the first thing he did, groggy with pain and the lingering fog of Doc Williams's laudanum, was ask whether the deputy had arrived. "He's here," Abigail said, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "Already gathering evidence. Already planning to speak with Judge Pruitt and Whitfield both. Caleb, I think we might actually win this." "Told you we would," Caleb said, wincing as he tried to shift himself more upright against the pillows. "Man like Grayson always overplays his hand eventually. Shooting me in the street last night, that wasn't the action of a man confident in his legal claims. That was desperation." "You could have died." "Could have," Caleb agreed, "but didn't. And now Grayson's got a federal deputy looking into exactly the kind of thing federal deputies take most seriously, on account of me not dying convenient enough for him to bury it as some unfortunate accident." He reached for her hand, his grip weaker than usual, but no less certain. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't, not really. Kept thinking about you bleeding on that ground, kept thinking about how close it came to being worse. Wasn't your fault." "Feels like it was," Abigail admitted, the words coming harder than she expected. "You wouldn't even be in Cedar Hollow if it weren't for me. Wouldn't have made an enemy of Grayson. Wouldn't be lying here with a bullet wound in your shoulder." Caleb was quiet a moment, studying her face with the same careful attention he'd given her that very first day in the street. "You remember what I told you that night on your back step, about choosing this?" "I remember. Wasn't a lie, Abigail. Wasn't something I said because it sounded fine in the moment. I chose this. Chose you. Chose standing beside you against a man like Grayson, knowing full well what kind of man he was capable of being. If that choice cost me a bullet in the shoulder, that's a cost I'm willing to carry, same as you've been carrying the cost of standing up to this whole town for 6 years running. Don't you dare sit there blaming yourself for a choice that was mine to make." Something in Abigail's chest loosened at that some knot of guilt she hadn't fully realized she was carrying until his words worked it free. "Thomas Miller's still in that jail cell," she said quietly. "Sarah's beside herself with worry, and I haven't had a spare minute to go sit with her the way I should have. Everything's happening so fast." "Then go," Caleb said. "I'm not going anywhere laid up like this. Go sit with Sarah. I'll still be here when you get back." Sarah Miller was sitting on her porch step when Abigail arrived, her 3 children playing listlessly in the yard behind her, and the exhaustion etched into her face told its own story before she said a single word. "They won't let me see him," Sarah said. "Sheriff Daniels says visiting rights are at his discretion, and apparently his discretion says I don't get any." "That's about to change," Abigail said, sitting down beside her. "There's a federal deputy in town now, man named Reeves. He's already investigating everything Grayson's done, the forged notes, your husband's charges, all of it. He means to speak with the sheriff about Thomas directly." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. The particular tears of a woman who'd been holding herself together through sheer necessity and could finally, for one brief moment, let some of that careful control slip. "Is it really happening? After everything? Is it really finally happening?" "I believe it is," Abigail said. "Grayson tried to have Caleb killed last night, shot him outside the livery. That's the kind of thing that gets federal attention fast, and once federal attention arrives, it doesn't leave until it's found the whole truth of what's been happening in this valley. Caleb was shot." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. He'll heal," Abigail said, though her voice caught slightly on the words. "Doc Williams says he was lucky. Half an inch different, and I'd be having a very different conversation with you right now." "He didn't have to do any of this," Sarah said softly. "Could have ridden back up his mountain the very first week and none of us would have blamed him for it. Man's got no family in this valley, no stake in any of our troubles. He said something similar to me once, Abigail said. Said a man forgets living alone that there's still people in the world worth caring about. I think helping this valley reminded him of that. I think that's worth more to him than the risk it cost. Sarah wiped her eyes, some of the desperate tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. Thank you, Abigail, for all of it. The evidence, the letters to the banks, sitting with Judge Pruitt in the dark, all of it. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You don't owe me anything, Abigail said. This is what neighbors do for each other. Should have been doing it all along this whole valley, instead of letting Grayson pick us off one at a time, because we were all too scared to stand together. Deputy Reeves found Sheriff Daniels at the jailhouse an hour later, and though Abigail wasn't present for the conversation itself, the results became apparent by evening when Sarah arrived breathless at the store to report that Thomas had been released. The assault charges dropped pending further investigation into the two witnesses who'd sworn to seeing something that apparently never happened. Reeves questioned them separate, Sarah said, still catching her breath from having run most of the way. Said their stories didn't match up on 3 separate details. Said if they didn't want to be charged with perjury themselves, they'd best reconsider their testimony real quick. Both of them recanted within the hour. Said Grayson's foreman had promised them a full season's wages if they'd just say what he told them to say. And Thomas, home, Sarah said, tears sliding freely down her face, now, happy tears this time. Home with our children where he belongs. Abigail. I don't know how to thank you enough. Thank Deputy Reeves, Abigail said, though the warmth in her chest at the news was undeniable. And thank Caleb if you get the chance. Though I imagine he'll wave off the gratitude the same way he always does. Judge Pruitt's testimony, given formally to Deputy Reeves the following morning, proved to be the piece that finally cracked the case wide open. Not only did he confirm his own analysis of the forged signature, he provided something Abigail hadn't even known existed, a paper trail of similar irregular notes that had crossed his desk over the past 2 years, each one connected however loosely to Silas Grayson's growing landholdings. I should have said something sooner, Pruitt admitted when Abigail visited him that afternoon to thank him for his testimony. I told myself I was protecting my own family by staying quiet, by finding small procedural delays instead of outright refusal. But quiet complicity is still complicity, Miss Whitmore. I understand that now, watching what almost happened to Mr. Stone, because I didn't have the courage to act sooner. You acted when it mattered most, Abigail said. That has to count for something. Perhaps, Pruitt said, though the guilt in his eyes suggested he hadn't fully forgiven himself. I intend to make it count for considerably more going forward. I've already begun reviewing every land transfer Grayson has brought before this court over the past 3 years. I suspect Deputy Reeves and I will be working closely together for some time. Whitfield's testimony came next, delivered with visible reluctance, but growing courage, as Deputy Reeves assured him repeatedly that federal protection would prevent any retaliation from Grayson's men. Man showed up 18 months back. Whitfield said, note in hand, said my grandfather had taken out a loan against the property back before he passed, 40 years now, since he died. Mind you note, conveniently impossible to verify against any bank that still had records that far back. Threatened to take the whole ranch if I didn't sell him 200 acres at whatever price he named. I took the deal because I had 4 children and no way to fight a man with Grayson's resources. You did what any reasonable man would do in your position, Reeves said. Nobody's holding that against you. What matters now is putting your testimony on record so this pattern can't continue against anyone else in this valley. By the 4th day, the evidence had grown into something Abigail could hardly have imagined possible just a week before 7 separate testimonies. 3 confirmed forged signatures documented proof of witness tampering in the Miller case, and a growing paper trail connecting Silas Grayson to a pattern of fraud that stretched back nearly 3 years and touched almost every corner of the valley. Caleb, healing steadily under Doc Williams's continued care, insisted on being present when Deputy Reeves finally rode out to Grayson's ranch to serve formal notice of the federal investigation, though Abigail argued fiercely against it. You can barely lift your arm above your shoulder, she said, standing in the doorway of the small room above the livery where he'd been recovering. You are not riding out to confront Silas Grayson. Not confronting anybody, Caleb said, already working his good arm through his shirt sleeve with careful, determined movements. Just riding along as a witness. Reeves asked me to come on account of I'm the one who got shot. Man's got a right to have the victim present when formal charges get discussed. Caleb, I'll sit my horse slow and careful, he said, and I won't say a single unnecessary word once we're there, and Hutch'll be riding beside me the whole way in case anything goes sideways. But I am not staying behind in this room while the man who tried to kill me finally answers for it. That's not something I'm willing to miss, Abigail, not for anything. She recognized in the stubborn set of his jaw the same determination she'd felt herself standing in the street 8 days before refusing to walk away from Boyd Caro's cruelty, and understood there was no arguing him out of it. Then I'm coming too, she said. Figured you would. Caleb said something almost like a smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. Wouldn't expect anything less from you. Silas Grayson's ranch house sat at the head of the valley, a sprawling structure that had clearly been built to announce its owner's wealth to anyone traveling the main road. And Grayson himself stood on the porch when Deputy Reeves's small party rode up the long drive, his composure once again fully restored, though something wary had crept into his eyes as he watched them approach. Deputy, Grayson said, descending the porch steps with careful, measured dignity. I understand you've been busy in Cedar Hollow this past week. I have, Reeves said, dismounting. Busy enough that I've prepared formal federal charges against you, Mr. Grayson, for fraud, forgery, witness tampering, and attempted murder in the shooting of Caleb Stone 3 nights past. Grayson's face went very still. That's an extraordinary accusation, Deputy, made on the word of a shopkeeper with a personal grudge and a wounded man who has every reason to exaggerate what happened to him in the dark. It's not made on their word alone, Reeves said. It's made on 7 separate testimonies from families across this valley on Judge Pruitt's own analysis, confirming multiple forged signatures on 2 of your own hired hands, recanting perjured testimony against Thomas Miller, once they understood the consequences of continued lying, and on a documented pattern of fraudulent land acquisitions stretching back nearly 3 years. I have more than enough here to see you held for federal trial, mister. Grayson and I intend to do exactly that. For a long moment, Grayson said nothing at all, his composed mask cracking slowly visibly in front of everyone gathered on his own front porch. This is absurd, he said finally, though the confidence had drained almost entirely from his voice. I built this valley's economy. I employed half these families you claim I've wronged. Without my investment, Cedar Hollow would still be nothing but a scattered handful of failing homesteads. You built your fortune stealing from the very people you claim to have helped. Abigail said, unable to hold her silence any longer. Every family you drove off their land, every note you forged, every threat you dressed up as concern for fragile arrangements. You didn't build this valley, Mr. Grayson. You cannibalized it. Something ugly flickered across Grayson's face, and for one tense moment, Abigail thought he might actually lunge at her, but Caleb shifted his weight forward on his horse just slightly, just enough to remind everyone present exactly why they were all gathered on this porch in the first place, and Grayson's rage folded back down into something colder and more controlled. You'll regret this, Grayson said, his voice low now, venomous. All of you. I have resources you cannot begin to imagine, lawyers who will tie up any federal case for years. Federal cases don't work the way territorial courts work, Mr. Grayson, Reeves said. Your money reaches exactly as far as county lines and beholden judges. It does not reach Washington, and it does not reach the federal marshal's office. And it most certainly does not reach a jury of citizens who will hear first-hand testimony from 7 families you've spent 3 years defrauding. Grayson's hands curled into fists at his sides, and Abigail watched with something that felt almost like disbelief as the man who had terrorized this entire valley for years finally visibly began to understand that his power had limits after all. I want to speak with my own lawyer before I say another word, Grayson said finally, some last vestige of composure reasserting itself. You're entitled to that, Reeves said. You're also under arrest effective immediately pending transport to the territorial courthouse for formal federal proceedings. My deputies will escort you there directly. Two men, Abigail hadn't noticed before, apparently riding with Reeves specifically for this purpose, moved forward to flank Grayson. And for the first time in the entire ordeal, Silas Grayson looked standing on his own porch, surrounded by federal authority. He could neither bribe nor intimidate, genuinely and completely powerless. The news moved through Cedar Hollow that same evening with the speed of wildfire, and by the following morning, the entire town had gathered unbidden in the street outside Abigail's store, drawn by the same hunger for spectacle that had brought them out 9 days before to watch her confront Boyd Caro. Except this time, the mood carried something entirely different. Relief. Vindication. And for many of them, a quiet, uncomfortable reckoning with exactly how long they'd allowed fear to keep them silent while Silas Grayson terrorized their neighbors, one family at a time. Norma Wells found Abigail behind the counter that morning, and for once there was no thread or button serving as pretense for her visit. "I owe you an apology," Norma said without preamble. "Not just for what I said in that street 9 days ago, for 6 years of it. Every whisper, every assumption, every time I let this town decide who you were without once bothering to ask you myself." "Norma, you don't have to." "I do have to," Norma said, firm now. "I watched you fight a man none of the rest of us had the courage to stand against. Watched you nearly lose everything you built. Watched a good man take a bullet defending what was right. And I realized, somewhere in the middle of it, that everything I'd ever said about you being too proud, too hard, too much, none of it was ever really about you at all. It was about the rest of us being uncomfortable with a woman who didn't need our approval to survive. That's not a flaw in you, Abigail. That was always our failing, not yours." Abigail felt her throat tighten, unexpected tears pricking at her eyes. "Thank you, Norma. That means more than you know." "I mean to make it right beyond just words," Norma said. "I've already spoken to half the church congregation about organizing proper support for the Millers and the Whitfields too, given everything Grayson stole from them. This town owes a debt to every family he wronged, and I intend to see it starts being paid." Caleb, still healing but growing stronger by the day, found Abigail on the back step that evening, the same step where they'd sat together the night before he'd ridden out for the marshal's office, and settled down beside her with careful, deliberate movements that spoke to lingering pain he was determined not to complain about. "Grayson's being held at the territorial courthouse," he said. "Reeves tells me the case against him is about as solid as federal cases come. Man's looking at years most likely once everything's properly tried." "It's over." Abigail said the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in her mouth after 9 days of relentless fear. "After everything, it's actually over. This part of it anyway," Caleb said. "Reckon there'll be paperwork and testimony and all manner of tedious legal business still ahead. But the part where a man threatens your life and mine, the part where families lose their homes to forged paper, that part's done." Abigail leaned into his good shoulder, careful of his injury, and felt him settle his arm around her with the same steady certainty he'd shown her from that very first day in the street. "I keep thinking about what Norma said this morning," she said quietly. "About how this town spent 6 years deciding who I was without ever once asking me directly. I spent those same 6 years believing I had to prove something to all of them. Had to be strong enough, capable enough that nobody could ever say I needed anyone or anything I hadn't earned entirely on my own. And now I understand that proving something to people who already decided not to see you clearly was never going to change anything," Abigail said. "The only thing that ever actually mattered was whether I could look at myself honestly and know I'd built something worth being proud of. Everything else was just noise." "That's a hard lesson to learn," Caleb said. "Took me 6 years on a mountain to learn something similar. Told myself I was protecting myself staying alone up there. Really, I was just hiding from the possibility that I might lose something again if I let myself want it." "And now?" Abigail echoed his question back to him. Caleb was quiet a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky above Cedar Hollow, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. "Now I know some things are worth the risk," he said. "Worth choosing even when choosing means a bullet in the shoulder or a fight against a man with more money than sense. I spent 6 years convinced that caring about anything again would break me clean in half if I lost it. Watching you fight for this valley, fight for people who didn't even deserve your loyalty half the time, given how they'd treated you, that taught me something different. Taught me that the alternative to risking loss isn't peace. It's just a slower kind of disappearing." Abigail turned to look at him fully, then searching his face in the fading light, and found nothing guarded there at all. None of the careful distance he'd carried that very first day at her counter. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "Grayson's case will take months to resolve. This town's still got a long way to go before 6 years of judgment simply disappears because of one difficult week. And I still have a store to run, still have a life I built entirely on my own terms that I'm not interested in abandoning just because—" "Wasn't asking you to abandon anything," Caleb said gently. "Never wanted that, Abigail. Wanted to stand beside the woman who built it, not replace her with somebody softer and easier. That's the whole point of everything I've been trying to say since that first morning in the street." "Then what are you asking?" Caleb considered the question with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a certainty that settled something deep and uncertain in Abigail's chest. "Asking if there's room in the life you built for a mountain man who's finally figured out he'd rather build something new beside you than keep hiding alone on a peak 2 days from anyone who might need him. Don't need an answer tonight. Reckon we've both got some healing left to do, you and me both in our own particular ways. But I wanted you to know the question's there whenever you're ready to answer it." Abigail didn't answer with words at all. She answered by resting her head against his good shoulder, careful of his wound, and staying there in the gathering dark, long after the last light had faded from the sky above Cedar Hollow. Two people who had both spent years building walls out of loss and fear, finally cautiously beginning to imagine what it might look like to build something together instead. The weeks that followed moved slower than Abigail expected, and faster too, in the strange way that difficult seasons often did once the worst of the danger had passed. Silas Grayson remained held at the territorial courthouse awaiting trial, and word filtered back to Cedar Hollow in pieces, carried by Deputy Reeves on his periodic visits to gather additional testimony. The case had grown, not shrunk, in the weeks since his arrest. 2 more families from neighboring valleys had come forward once they heard Grayson could no longer intimidate them into silence, each one adding fresh weight to charges that already seemed unlikely to leave him free again for a very long time. "Federal prosecutor tells me he's looking at 15 years minimum," Reeves said, sitting across the counter from Abigail on one such visit, coffee cooling untouched in front of him while he worked through his notes. "Fraud alone would have been serious enough. Attempted murder on top of it, with a witness alive to testify. That's the kind of charge that doesn't leave much room for a light sentence." 15 years, Abigail repeated, letting the number settle. "Feels strange hearing it said plain like that. Almost too simple after everything." "Justice usually feels that way once it finally arrives," Reeves said. "Slower than it should be, and somehow smaller than the wound it's meant to answer for. Doesn't make it any less real, though." Caleb, seated nearby, with his shoulder healing steadily under a sling he still wore more out of Doc Williams's stubborn insistence than any lingering necessity, spoke up from his chair near the window. "What happens to the land? All them acres Grayson took through forged notes." "Federal court's already begun the process of returning what can be documented," Reeves said. "Whitfield's 200 acres most likely, given how clean his testimony was. Others will take longer depending on how thoroughly the original fraud was buried in paperwork. But it's happening, Mr. Stone. Slow as justice always seems to move, it's happening." Thomas Miller returned to work on his ranch within days of his release, though Abigail noticed on her visits to check on Sarah and the children that something in him had changed. He moved more carefully, now spoke less freely, carried the particular wariness of a man who had learned firsthand exactly how easily the ground beneath a family's feet could shift when someone with enough money decided to make it shift. "He doesn't sleep well," Sarah admitted one afternoon, watching her husband work the fence line from a distance while their children played nearby. "Wakes up some nights certain he hears riders coming. Takes him a good while to remember Grayson's locked up 2 counties over and can't reach us anymore. That'll ease with time, Abigail said, though she recognized the particular shape of Sarah's worry, having carried something similar herself through the long nights of that terrible week. Fear doesn't disappear the moment the danger does. Takes a while longer for the body to catch up to what the mind already knows. You'd know something about that. More than I ever expected to, Abigail admitted. Cedar Hollow itself had begun to feel different too, in ways Abigail hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely certain how to hold. Customers who had once avoided lingering too long in her store, wary of being seen too friendly with a woman. The town had spent years quietly judging, now stayed to talk, to ask after her well-being, to offer help with the window repairs that still needed finishing along the store's north side. Norma Wells had made good on her promise, organizing a proper collection among the church congregation to help the Whitfield family rebuild what Grayson's fraud had cost them, and though the effort came 6 years too late to undo the town's earlier silence, Abigail found herself grateful for it. Nonetheless, understanding that people could only begin making amends from wherever they currently stood, not from some earlier point they'd already let slip past. Boyd Caro, of all people, came into the store one gray morning, nearly a month after Grayson's arrest, hat in hand, looking considerably less confident than he had that first day in the street. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and something in his voice carried genuine discomfort. "Wanted to say my piece if you'll let me." "I'm listening." "What I said that morning about you being too hard, too much for any man to want, that was cruel, and it wasn't even true. And I've had a good long while to sit with the shame of having said it in front of half the town." He turned his hat over in his hands, unable quite to meet her eyes. "Watched everything that happened after. Watched you nearly lose your store. Watched a good man take a bullet. Watched this whole town nearly let a criminal keep terrorizing us because we were all too comfortable letting somebody else be the target of our fear instead of speaking up ourselves. I was part of that comfort, Miss Whitmore. Ashamed to admit it, but I was. Why tell me now?" "Because Curtis lost his job standing up for what was right, and I never once did the same," Boyd said. "Kid's near 10 years younger than me, and showed more backbone than I managed my whole life. Figured the least I could do was finally say, 'I'm sorry,' plain and proper, instead of just letting it sit unspoken and pretending it didn't matter." Abigail studied him a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his discomfort against 6 years of accumulated hurt, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him. "Apology accepted, Boyd," she said. "Doesn't erase what was said. But I imagine it's worth something you saying it plain instead of letting it stay buried." "That's more grace than I deserve," Boyd said, and left the store looking for the first time since Abigail had known him like a man, genuinely lighter for having finally set something heavy down. Curtis, for his part, found steady work at the Miller Ranch. Within weeks, Thomas Miller, having heard the full story of his role in exposing Grayson's fraud and insisting on hiring him the moment his own operation had stabilized enough to afford another hand. "Man deserves work after what he risked," Thomas said when Abigail mentioned it to him during one of her visits. "Boy stood up when it mattered, cost him his job, and near enough his safety besides. That's the kind of character worth investing in." Curtis himself, when Abigail encountered him a few days later delivering supplies to the ranch, seemed almost embarrassed by the gratitude directed his way. "Wasn't nothing special," he said, shifting a feed sack with more attention than the task strictly required. "Just did what my pa would have wanted. Don't feel right everybody making a fuss over it." "Sometimes doing what's right feels like nothing special while you're doing it," Abigail said. "Doesn't make it any less rare, Curtis. This valley's got plenty of people who knew what was right and stayed quiet anyway. You didn't. That matters whether it feels special to you or not." Caleb's shoulder healed steadily through those weeks, Doc Williams finally releasing him from the sling entirely by the start of the following month, though a faint stiffness remained that Abigail suspected would linger through every cold winter for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of exactly how close Cedar Hollow had come to losing him. He had not in all that time spoken again of the question he'd raised that evening on the back step, the question about whether there was room in the life she'd built for a mountain man willing to build something new beside her. And Abigail found herself more than once wondering whether he'd reconsidered whether the urgency of danger passing had cooled something that had only burned so bright under the pressure of shared crisis. She raised it herself, finally, on an evening when the store had closed early, and the two of them sat together on the same back step where so much of their story had already unfolded. "You never answered your own question," she said. "The one about building something new. Been weeks now, and you've said nothing more about it." Caleb was quiet a moment, and something in his stillness made her stomach drop with sudden uncertainty. "Wasn't trying to avoid it," he said finally. "Was trying to give you room to answer in your own time without me pressing on it before you'd had a chance to breathe properly after everything that happened. Figured a woman who just survived what you survived deserved a little peace before anybody asked her to make a decision that big." Relief loosened something tight in Abigail's chest. "That's remarkably considerate of you. Try to be when it matters." Caleb said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Doesn't mean the question's gone anywhere, though. Still sitting right where I left it. Still mean every word of it." "Then I suppose I should answer it properly," Abigail said, turning to face him fully in the fading light. "Yes, Caleb Stone. There's room. Been room for a good while now, if I'm honest with myself, though. It took me longer than it should have to admit it plain." Something shifted across his face. Then relief, and something warmer both, and he reached for her hand, with the same steady certainty he'd shown from that very first day. "What does that room look like exactly?" he asked. "Because I'll be honest, Abigail, I don't much fancy the idea of you giving up this store, this life you built with your own two hands. And I've got a ranch 2 days up the mountain that's mine in every way that matters, even with Grayson's old debt still hanging over part of it, until the federal court sorts through the last of his tangled paperwork. Then maybe the answer isn't choosing one life over the other," Abigail said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. "Maybe the answer is building something that holds both. You've got grazing land and open country. I've got a business that supplies half this valley and a mind for numbers that could use expanding beyond just flour and rope. You're talking about combining them. I'm talking about a partnership," Abigail said, "in every sense of the word. A ranch that raises cattle worth selling, and a store that knows how to sell them properly, run by two people who've already proven they can survive considerably worse than the ordinary difficulties of building something together." Caleb studied her for a long moment, something like wonder moving behind his pale gray-green eyes. "You've been thinking about this a while. Longer than I've been willing to admit," Abigail said. "Since before Grayson, if I'm honest. Since that very first week watching you stand in this store not trying to fix me or soften me, just seeing me plain for exactly what I already was." "That's the only way I know how to see anybody worth seeing," Caleb said quietly. The proposal itself, when it finally came, arrived with none of the grand theater Abigail might have once imagined for such a moment, and everything of the plain, steady honesty that had defined every part of Caleb Stone since that very first day. He asked her on an ordinary Tuesday morning, standing behind her own counter while she tallied the week's receipts. No crowd gathered, no dramatic gesture. Just Caleb reaching into his coat pocket and setting a small ring on the ledger page in front of her, simple and unadorned, clearly not purchased from any jeweler's shop this deep into Montana territory. "Made it myself," he said before she could ask. "Took the silver conchos off an old bridle that belonged to my father, melted them down proper with help from the blacksmith. Figured you'd rather have something built than something bought, given everything you've spent your whole life building yourself." Abigail's hands trembled as she picked it up, turning it over in the morning light, and found something in its simple, hand-hammered imperfection more moving than any polished gem could have managed. "Caleb Stone," she said, her voice unsteady. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "Reckon I am," Caleb said. "Asking if you'll marry me, Abigail Whitmore. Not because you need saving on account of I've watched you save yourself and half this valley. Besides, without any help from me or anybody else. Asking because I love you, plain and complete, exactly as you are, stubborn and strong and sharper with numbers than any man I've ever met, and I'd be honored to spend whatever years I've got left building something beside you instead of alone on that mountain." Abigail set down her pen, came around the counter, and answered him the only way that felt true enough to match the moment. Yes, she said. 1,000 times yes, Caleb Stone. Not because I need a husband to complete some life I was already living fully on my own, but because I choose you same as you chose me, back when this whole town thought I was too much for any man to want. News of the engagement moved through Cedar Hollow with predictable speed, though the reception it received bore little resemblance to the whispers and judgment that had once trailed Abigail through every corner of town. Norma Wells arrived at the store within the hour, having apparently heard the news from 3 separate sources, before it had even properly settled. Her eyes bright with genuine happiness, rather than the calculating hunger for gossip that had once colored every visit. I knew it, she said, embracing Abigail with unexpected warmth. The moment that man stood up to Boyd Caro in the street, I knew there was something real in it, even if none of us dared say so out loud at the time. You told me a fortress was a lonely place to grow old in, Abigail reminded her, laughing despite herself. And I was wrong to say it the way I did, Norma admitted. But I wasn't entirely wrong in the sentiment, was I? Everybody deserves somebody worth building a life beside Abigail. Took this whole valley, nearly losing you both, to understand you'd already found exactly that. The wedding, when it finally came together some 6 weeks later, was a modest affair by most standards, held in the small church at the center of Cedar Hollow, with barely 50 people gathered inside its plain wooden walls. But what it lacked in grandeur, it more than made up for in the particular weight of everyone present. A town that had spent 6 years deciding who Abigail Whitmore was, now gathered entirely to celebrate the truth of who she'd always actually been. Sarah Miller sat in the second pew with Thomas beside her, their children fidgeting quietly through the ceremony, Thomas's hand wrapped tight around his wife's the entire time, in the particular way of a man who understood now more than ever exactly how precious an ordinary Sunday morning together could be. Curtis stood near the back, having borrowed a proper coat for the occasion, his young face carrying an expression of quiet pride that suggested he understood on some level that he'd played his own small but crucial part in the story unfolding before him. Judge Pruitt sat near the front, his testimony against Grayson having cost him considerably in the political favor he'd once carefully cultivated, though the peace visible in his weathered face suggested he'd found the trade worthwhile. Even Boyd Caro attended, standing quietly near the doorway, and though he said little to anyone through the ceremony itself, he stayed until the very end, and that Abigail understood was its own kind of apology, continued. Hutch stood as Caleb's witness, gruff and visibly uncomfortable in his one good suit, though the pride in his weathered eyes betrayed how deeply he'd come to care for the man he'd helped protect through the worst of the danger. Deputy Reeves, having ridden back through Cedar Hollow specifically for the occasion, despite the demands of Grayson's ongoing prosecution, sat near the back with the particular satisfaction of a man who understood he'd witnessed something rare. A genuine happy ending emerging from the wreckage of the crimes he'd spent his career fighting. "Do you, Caleb Stone, take this woman?" the pastor began, and Caleb's voice, when he answered, carried none of the roughness Abigail had grown accustomed to, only a steady, unshakable certainty that settled deep into her chest. "I do," he said, completely and without reservation. When it came her turn, Abigail found her own voice steadier than she'd expected, 6 years of proving her strength to a doubtful town, having prepared her in the end for exactly this moment of choosing something entirely for herself. "I do," she said, and meant it more fully than she had ever meant anything in her life. The reception that followed spilled out into the street in front of the church tables, borrowed from half the households in Cedar Hollow, laden with food contributed by neighbors who 6 weeks earlier might never have imagined themselves celebrating Abigail Whitmore's happiness so freely. Sarah found her during a quiet moment, both women stepping away from the noise and celebration for a few minutes of private conversation. "Thomas and I have been talking," Sarah said, "about the store and the ranch you and Caleb mean to combine. We were wondering if you might consider taking on a partner in the cattle side of things. Thomas has always had a good eye for breeding stock, and between your business sense and Caleb's land, seems like there might be room for more than just the two of you to build something worthwhile out of all this." "I think that's a fine idea," Abigail said. "This whole valley could use more people building together instead of everyone struggling alone the way we all were before. Grayson taught us that lesson the hard way. Sarah said. Wish it hadn't taken something so terrible to teach it. But I suppose better late than never. Caleb found Abigail near the edge of the gathering as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, and though the celebration continued behind them, the two of them stood quietly apart for a moment, taking in everything that had happened since that first terrible morning in the street. Feels strange, Abigail said, looking back at everything that's happened since you rode into this town. Feels like a different life entirely, the woman I was that first day, so certain she'd spend the rest of her years proving to a town that had already decided against her that she could survive perfectly well alone. You still proved it, Caleb said. Nothing about marrying me erases 6 years of surviving entirely on your own strength, Abigail. This isn't about needing me to complete something that was missing. It's about choosing to build something bigger than either of us could have built separate. I know that, Abigail said. I think I always knew it, even in the middle of the worst of it, even when Grayson had me convinced I might lose everything I'd built. I think what I didn't know, what this whole town never let me believe, was that a woman could be entirely strong and entirely loved at the very same time. That those two things weren't opposites fighting against each other. Never should have been opposites in the first place, Caleb said. Man who thinks a woman's strength makes her unlovable was never worth her love to begin with. Took me losing everything once to understand that plain. Glad I finally did in time to choose you properly instead of hiding from it up on that mountain. They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun began its slow descent over Cedar Hollow. The town spread out around them, transformed in the span of a single difficult summer, from a place that had spent 6 years quietly deciding who Abigail Whitmore was, into a community that had finally painfully learned to look at people honestly, instead of settling for whatever story felt most comfortable to believe. What happens now? Abigail asked, though the question carried none of the fear it might have carried months before, only genuine curiosity about the shape of the life stretching out ahead of them both. Now, Caleb said, drawing her close, despite the lingering stiffness in his healing shoulder. We build something neither one of us could have built alone, a ranch that raises the finest cattle in this territory. A store that supplies half the valley honestly the way it always should have been supplied. Children, maybe, if that's something you still want given everything you've already built without needing anybody else's blessing to do it. I think I'd like that, Abigail said softly. Building a family with a man who never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I already was. Wouldn't dream of asking you to be anything else, Caleb said. Fell in love with the woman who stood in that street and refused to apologize for surviving. Wouldn't want her any other way, not for anything in this world. The years that followed proved everything that final summer had promised. Silas Grayson's trial concluded that autumn with a sentence of 18 years, the federal prosecutor having successfully argued that the attempted murder charge alone warranted the maximum penalty available under territorial law, and the land he'd stolen through years of forged documents and manufactured debt was gradually returned to the families who'd rightfully owned it, piece by careful piece, as federal investigators untangled the full extent of his fraud. Cedar Hollow itself changed slowly but genuinely in the years that followed, the particular reckoning that Grayson's exposure had forced upon the town settling into something more permanent than simple relief at having survived a crisis. Neighbors who had once watched silently while families lost everything to a wealthy man's greed learned gradually the deeper cost of that silence, and though old habits died slowly, Cedar Hollow became, over time, a town considerably less willing to let fear dictate its collective conscience. The Stone Ranch, as it came to be known throughout the valley, grew steadily under Caleb and Abigail's combined management, cattle raised on the high mountain grazing land. Caleb had once claimed in solitary grief, now sold through the very store Abigail had built with her own hands. The two halves of their separate lives woven together into something considerably stronger than either had managed alone. Thomas Miller became a full partner in the cattle operation within 2 years, his eye for breeding stock proving exactly as valuable as Sarah had promised, and the Miller and Stone families grew close enough that their children born within a year of each other would eventually grow up together as inseparable as siblings. Curtis, having proven his loyalty and character through the worst of Grayson's reign, eventually took over management of the ranch's day-to-day operations as Caleb's trusted foreman. the young man who had once stood laughing beside Boyd Caro in the street, having transformed through his own deliberate choices into exactly the kind of man his father would have been proud to claim. Norma Wells became somewhat improbably one of Abigail's closest friends in the years that followed. The woman's sharp eye for gossip repurposed into an equally sharp eye for identifying families across the valley who needed quiet, practical help. Help that Norma now organized with the same energy she'd once devoted to speculation and judgment. And Abigail Whitmore, who had spent 6 long years believing that strength and love could never coexist in the same life, who had stood in the middle of a dusty street and refused to apologize for surviving on her own terms, found herself in the years that followed exactly as strong and exactly as loved as she had ever dared to imagine possible. She never stopped running her store. She never softened the particular sharpness that had once made half of Cedar Hollow uncomfortable and now made her one of the valley's most respected businesswomen. She never became smaller or easier or more convenient, not for Caleb, not for anyone. She simply finally stopped believing she had to choose between being strong and being loved. Because the truth. Cedar Hollow had taken an entire summer of fear and violence and hard-won courage to finally understand was the same truth Caleb Stone had seen clearly from that very first morning in the street, watching a woman refuse to apologize for surviving while an entire town laughed at her expense. Abigail Whitmore had never needed fixing. She had never needed softening or saving or shaping into some smaller, more comfortable version of herself that the world found easier to love. She had only ever needed someone willing to see her exactly as she already was and love her precisely because of it, not in spite of it. And in Caleb Stone standing quiet and steady at the edge of a street where a whole town had once decided she was too much for any man to want, she had finally completely found exactly that. The woman everyone said was too much for any man to love had proven in the end that she had never been too much at all. She had simply been waiting for a man strong enough and gentle enough and honest enough to see the whole of her clearly and choose her anyway.